The alarm shrieked at 4:30 in the morning, a sound Cameron Wells had grown to associate with survival rather than waking. His hand shot out from under the thin blanket, silencing the phone, before the noise could penetrate the wall into Lucas's room. The apartment remained dark except for the amber glow of streetlights filtering through blinds that hung at an angle, one corner permanently bent from the day he'd installed them wrong in his exhaustion. He sat up on the pull-out couch springs, groaning under his weight, and pressed his palms against his eyes until colors bloomed behind the lids. The kitchen clock's green numbers confirmed what his body already knew. 16 minutes to shower, dress, check on Lucas, and catch the first bus downtown. He moved through the routine with the efficiency of someone who'd calculated. Every second, who understood that wasted time meant wasted money, and wasted money meant another month in this apartment with its persistent mold smell and radiators that clanged like prisoners on bars. Steam filled the bathroom, a luxury he allowed himself for exactly 4 minutes. The hot water eased the permanent ache in his lower back, the souvenir from lifting industrial cleaning equipment for 3 years. He scrubbed with a generic soap that left his hands dry and cracked, then stepped out into cold air that raised goosebumps across his shoulders. The mirror had fogged completely. He wiped a circle clear with his forearm and studied the face looking back. 34 years old, but the lines around his eyes suggested someone a decade older. Dark circles that never fully disappeared, no matter how much sleep he managed to steal. A jaw that needed shaving, but would have to wait until tomorrow because razors cost money, and this one was already dull. He dressed in the uniform that defined his first job, gray shirt with precision cleaning services embroidered across the pocket, dark pants that hid Stain's boots with soles worn smooth. The shirt smelled faintly of bleach and the sweat, no matter how many times he washed it. He tucked the fabric in, fastened his belt, and moved to Lucas's door. The boy slept with one arm thrown over his head, exactly as Rebecca used to sleep. Cameron stood in the doorway watching his son's chest rise and fall, the peaceful expression that only came during these early hours before responsibility and awareness crept back in. Lucas would wake at 6:15, give himself enough time to dress, eat cereal, and catch the school bus at 7:10. Cameron had trained him to be independent out of necessity, teaching an 8-year-old to function alone because his father wouldn't be there to help with breakfast or homework or the 1,000 small moments that comprise a childhood. The note sat on the kitchen counter where Lucas would find it. Same location every morning, same blocky handwriting. Love you, buddy. Leftover pizza in fridge for dinner. I'll check your homework when I get home. Be good, Dad. He'd started adding small drawings to the notes 6 months ago, crude sketches of robots or spaceships that made Lucas smile. Today's featured a stick figure with a cape which his son would recognize as himself. The little things mattered when you couldn't provide the big ones. Cameron locked the apartment door, tested the handle twice, and descended 5 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken for 2 months, and the landlord's promises of repair had become white noise. The November air bit through his jacket, sharp and unforgiving. Chicago mornings at this hour belonged to delivery trucks and street cleaners and people like him, the invisible workforce that prepared the city for those who would never notice their existence. The bus arrived 3 minutes late, which meant he'd be cutting it close at the office building downtown. He found a seat near the back and pulled out his phone, checking the balance on his debit card through the bank app. $473 until next Friday. Rent was due in 8 days. Lucas needed new shoes because his current pair had developed holes that let in water. The electric bill would arrive any day now, probably north of $80 because the apartment's insulation was non-existent. He opened a different app when he'd built himself during lunch breaks that tracked his income across all 3 jobs against projected expenses. The spreadsheet showed him living with a margin of error so thin that a single unexpected cost could topple everything. Last month, it had been a cavity that Lucas needed filled. The month before, a speeding ticket because he'd been rushing between moms and hadn't noticed the limit change. Each financial shock sent ripples through weeks of careful planning, forcing him to make calculations about which bill could be paid late, what food could be stretched further, whether he could skip meals to ensure Lucas ate enough. The office building rose 40 stories above Michigan Avenue, all glass and steel, and the kind of modern architecture that suggested wealth and progress. Cameron entered through the service entrance in the alley, nodded to the security guard, who never remembered his name, and took the freight elevator to the basement where the cleaning supplies lived. His supervisor, a woman named Martha who managed 3 dozen cleaners across 5 buildings, was already reviewing assignments on her clipboard. Wells, you've got floors 18 through 22, full trash collection vacuum high traffic areas, bathroom deep clean on 20. 2 hours maximum, then you're due at your next location. He nodded, grabbed his equipment cart, and started the work that required no thought, only motion. Empty trash cans into the large rolling bin, replace liners, spray disinfectant on desks, wipe in circular motions, vacuum in straight lines to leave the pattern that proved the carpet had been cleaned. The offices were empty at this hour, filled only with the detritus of yesterday's business coffee cups with dried rings at the bottom, scattered papers, the occasional personal photo that offered glimpses into lives he'd never touch. Floor 20 belonged to a financial services company. He moved through cubicles, each one identical, except for the personal items that marked territory. A woman's workspace held photos of 2 children and a golden retriever. A man's desk displayed a degree from Northwestern University in a frame that probably cost more than Cameron's monthly food budget. He emptied their trash cans and wondered what it felt like to occupy spaces like these, to spend 8 hours a day pursuing work that engaged the mind rather than just the body. The bathroom deep clean required 20 minutes of concentrated effort. He scrubbed toilets, mopped floors, refilled soap dispensers, cleaned mirrors until they reflected without streaks. The work was honest but mind-numbing, the kind of labor that let his thoughts drift to places he tried to avoid. Memories of a different life, when he'd been the one sitting in an office when his hands had held drafting pencils, instead of mop handles, when colleagues had asked his opinion on load-bearing calculations and servo motor specifications, rather than whether he'd emptied the trash in conference room B. 6 years at Baxter Technologies. Lead mechanical engineer by 29. Projects that challenged him, that made him wake excited to solve problems nobody else could crack. He'd been building a reputation, accumulating patents, earning respect. Rebecca had been proud, attending company events in dresses she'd saved for introducing herself as the wife of the brilliant engineer who was going places. They'd bought a small house in a suburb with good schools, planning for Lucas's future for siblings Lucas would never have, for a life that had seemed inevitable until it wasn't. The cancer diagnosis came on a Tuesday in March. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, words the oncologist delivered with practiced sympathy that couldn't soften their meaning. 14 months if they pursued aggressive treatment. Maybe 8 without it. Rebecca had been 31 years old, Lucas barely 5, and Cameron's world had compressed into a single imperative fight. He'd taken a leave of absence from Baxter, intending it to be temporary. The company had been understanding, initially offering condolences and assurances that his position would be waiting. But 14 months became a number that kept shrinking as treatment costs expanded. Chemotherapy, radiation, experimental trials that insurance deemed unnecessary. The medical bills arrived in envelopes that grew thicker each week, each one representing a choice between bankrupting his family or watching his wife die. He'd burned through their savings in 4 months. Refinanced the house in 6. Started selling possessions by month 8, watching strangers cart away wedding gifts and furniture, and Rebecca's collection of vintage books, because money in hand mattered more than sentimental value. Baxter's understanding had evolved into concern about his return date, then into suggestions that perhaps he should consider his options, then into a polite termination letter that arrived while he sat in a hospital room holding Rebecca's hand as morphine dulled the pain that had become her constant companion. She died on a morning that felt like any other, slipping away, while he read to her from a book she could no longer focus on. Lucas had been at school, spared the final moment, but not the aftermath. The funeral cost $6,000 they didn't have. The house went into foreclosure 3 months later. Cameron and Lucas moved into this apartment with 2 suitcases and a garbage bag of clothes, starting over, with nothing except each other and debt that felt like a physical weight crushing his chest every time he tried to breathe. He'd searched for engineering positions, sending out resumes that highlighted his experience and glossed over the 2-year gap. Every interview followed the same pattern. Initial interest, then questions about why he'd left Baxter, then visible skepticism when he explained caregiving, then promises to be in touch that never materialized. Hiring managers wanted engineers who'd kept current, who hadn't stepped away during crucial years of industry evolution. A gap of months might be forgivable. A gap of years suggested someone who'd lost their edge, whose skills had atrophied, who couldn't be trusted with projects that required cutting-edge knowledge. After 6 months of rejections, he'd stopped applying for engineering jobs and started taking whatever work would accept him. Precision Cleaning Services hired him within a week. The pay was $9 an hour, barely enough to cover rent on the cheapest apartment he could find. So he'd added a second job, delivering lunch orders for a food app, racing around the city on a bicycle he'd bought, used dodging traffic for tips that sometimes added up to $50 a day if he worked through both lunch and dinner rushes. And when that still wasn't enough, when the bills kept coming and Lucas kept growing and needing things, he'd added the overnight security position at Stellar Dynamics. Cameron finished the bathroom, returned his car to the basement, and clocked out at exactly 7:45. 15 minutes to reach the bicycle depot where he picked up his delivery bag and phone mount. The lunch shift started at 8, running until 2 in the afternoon. 6 hours of constant motion that left his legs burning and his lungs raw from cold air and exhaust fumes. The app pinged with his first order at 8:17. Thai restaurant on Clark Street, delivery to an office building on Wacker Drive. He accepted, pedaling through traffic that showed no mercy to cyclists threading between taxis and buses, and cars whose drivers seemed to regard his presence as an inconvenience rather than a person trying to survive. The restaurant had the food ready, 2 plastic containers stapled into a bag, with extra napkins he'd requested, because customers appreciated small considerations, and better tips followed from appreciated customers. The ride to Wacker Drive required dodging a construction zone where the street had narrowed to a single lane. A truck driver honked as Cameron squeezed past the sound, aggressive enough to make him flinch. He delivered the food to a receptionist who barely looked up from her computer, offering a mechanical thank you that matched her expression. The tip was $2 on a $30 order. He added it to his mental tally and moved to the next ping. 11 deliveries before noon. Lunch orders flowing from restaurants to offices, fueling people who had the luxury of ordering food instead of packing leftovers or skipping meals entirely. He stopped once to drink water from the bottle he kept in his bag, standing in an alley, because pausing on the street meant losing time. His phone buzzed with a text from Lucas, sent during the boys' lunch period at school. The message was simple: "I got an A on my math test. Love you, Dad." Cameron's chest tightened with a pride so fierce it hurt. He typed back, "That's my boy. So proud of you. We'll celebrate tonight." They'd celebrate with dollar store cookies and the knowledge that Lucas worked harder than any 8-year-old should have to work, sitting at his tiny desk each night, while Cameron moved between jobs, teaching himself to be self-sufficient, because his father couldn't be there to guide him through childhood the way fathers were supposed to. By 2 o'clock, Cameron had completed 18 deliveries and earned $93 in total, including tips. He returned the delivery bag, unlocked his own bicycle from the rack where he'd left it, and pedaled to the apartment to shower and eat something before his evening shift started. Lucas would be home from school soon, and Cameron wanted to be there to see his son, to hear about the math test and the day's small victories, to be present for the 30 minutes they'd have together before he had to leave again. The apartment was empty when he arrived. He ate standing up leftover rice and chicken from 2 days ago, washing it down with water, because buying drinks meant spending money on something other than sustenance. He showered again, changing into the black pants and white button-down shirt required for security positions. His phone alarm was set for 4:30. He had time to close his eyes for 20 minutes rest. That wouldn't qualify as sleep, but might dull the exhaustion that had become his default state. Lucas's key turned in the lock at 3:40. Cameron heard his son enter, drop his backpack by the door, and move toward his room. He got up from the couch, meeting Lucas in the narrow hallway. The boy's face lit up. His school uniform was rumpled, tie loose around his neck. One knee of his pants, grass-stained from recess. He hugged Cameron with the unself-conscious affection of children who hadn't yet learned to hide their emotions. "I saw your text about the math test. That's incredible, buddy." Lucas pulled back, grinning. "It was hard. Word problems about fractions. But I remembered what you taught me about finding common denominators. That's because you're smart and you work hard. I'm proud of you." The boy's expression shifted slightly, happiness mixing with something more complicated. "Are you leaving soon?" "At 4:30, but I'll be back tonight after you're asleep. There's pizza in the fridge for dinner. Do your homework first, okay? And practice your reading." Lucas nodded, already used to this routine, already understanding that his father worked these hours out of necessity rather than choice. The boy moved to his room, and Cameron heard him unzipping his backpack, settling in to start homework, without being reminded because Lucas had learned to carry responsibilities that shouldn't belong to 8-year-olds. Cameron wanted to stay, wanted to help with the homework, make a proper dinner and present for the evening hours when parents and children are supposed to be together. Instead, he grabbed his jacket, checked that his wallet contained the ID badge that would let him into Stellar Dynamics, and left with the image of his son, hunched over a desk working alone, while his father chased money that never felt like enough. The security position paid $12 an hour, better than cleaning, but still poverty wages for someone who'd once earned $65,000 annually as an engineer. He worked the evening shift, 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning, 8 hours of monitoring doors and checking badges and walking rounds through empty offices where the real work happened during daylight. The overnight supervisor, a retired cop named Frank, treated Cameron with distant courtesy, neither friendly nor hostile, simply indifferent to the man who showed up every evening and performed his duties with quiet competence. Stellar Dynamics occupied floors 15 through 22 of a downtown tower. The company designed and manufactured automation systems for industrial applications, exactly the kind of work Cameron used to do, exactly the kind of environment where he'd once belonged. Now he sat at a desk in the lobby on the 15th floor, watching employees badge in and out, nodding to faces that never bothered to learn his name. The evening brought a trickle of engineers, working late programmers, debugging code managers, preparing presentations for morning meetings. They moved past his desk with distraction and their eyes focused on problems Cameron could probably solve if anyone thought to ask. A young engineer struggled with a rolling cart loaded with prototype equipment, the wheels catching on the elevator threshold. Cameron rose to help steadying the cart while the engineer maneuvered it inside. The kid barely acknowledged him, just a quick nod before the elevator doors closed. Cameron returned to his desk and pulled out the notebook he kept hidden beneath his jacket. 7 spiral-bound books lived under the couch cushions at home, each one filled with designs he drew during stolen moments, problems he solved in his head, while his body performed mindless labor. The current notebook was number 8, already half filled with sketches and calculations that flowed from his pencil whenever exhaustion couldn't quite override the part of his brain that refused to stop being an engineer. Tonight's design focused on an automated inventory system, something he'd been refining for 3 months. The concept was elegant. Distributed servo motors coordinated through a central controller, moving items along predetermined paths based on real-time demand data. Load sensors would provide feedback, adjusting motor speed to prevent damage to delicate items, while maximizing throughput for bulk materials. The system could revolutionize warehouse operations, reducing labor costs and improving accuracy. It was the kind of innovation that earned patents, that launched careers that should have been presented in conference rooms rather than sketched in security guard notebooks during quiet hours when nobody was watching. He drew with the precision that years of engineering had ingrained, each line deliberate, each calculation verified. The servo array required specific spacing to handle varying load weights without overstraining individual motors. He calculated torque requirements, factored in safety margins, designed the pressure-sensitive feedback loop that would prevent system failures. The work absorbed him completely, pulling him into a mental space where he was Cameron Wells, the engineer again, where his mind engaged with problems that mattered, where his skills found expression, even if nobody would ever see the results. The clock showed 11:40 when he finally set down his pencil-flexing fingers that had cramped from gripping too hard. 4 pages of new designs, refinements to the servo array that solved a stability problem he'd identified last week. It was good work. Maybe the best design he'd produced in the 3 years since Rebecca died. And it would sit in this notebook like all the others, seen by nobody, contributing nothing except the private satisfaction of knowing he could still create. He slipped the notebook back under his jacket and stood to make his hourly rounds through the building. The 15th floor was dark except for emergency lighting. He walked the perimeter, checking doors, noting that conference room C's lock needed maintenance, that someone had left a laptop charging in an empty office. Floors 16 through 20 were similarly quiet, the weekend shift long gone, leaving only the hum of computers on standby and the LED blink of security cameras recording his passage. Floor 21 housed the executive offices. Cameron had seen the CEO exactly twice in 3 years, both times from a distance, a woman in expensive suits who moved through the building surrounded by assistants and importance. Vivian Harper, according to the nameplate outside her corner office. He'd looked her up once out of curiosity, finding a profile in a business magazine that described her as a visionary leader who'd grown stellar dynamics from a mid-sized manufacturer into an industry innovator. She was 42, a single mother based on one brief mention of a teenage daughter, and accomplished in ways that reminded Cameron of everything he'd lost. He completed his rounds and returned to the lobby desk, sitting heavily in the chair that had molded to his shape over 3 years. 2 more hours until his shift ended, then the bus ride home, then 3 hours of sleep before starting the cycle again. His phone showed a text from Martha asking if he could cover an additional building tomorrow morning. The extra 2 hours meant extra $18, which meant yes, he'd take it, even though his body was already screaming for rest. The front doors opened at 1:47, unusual, because the building should have been locked to external entry after 11. Cameron looked up to see two people entering: an older man in a suit who badged through security without hesitation, and a younger guy carrying a laptop bag who followed closely behind. They moved to the elevators and Cameron noted their faces in case Frank asked during the end-of-shift report. His shift ended at 2 exactly. Frank arrived to take over the overnight desk, exchanging minimal conversation before Cameron clocked out and left through the main doors. The November night had grown colder, temperature dropping into the 30s, his breath visible in the streetlight glow. He walked to the bus stop, checking his phone for the schedule, finding he'd missed the last direct route and would need to transfer downtown. The first bus arrived 15 minutes later. He sat near the front, surrounded by other night shift workers whose faces reflected the same exhaustion he felt. A woman in scrubs, probably a nurse finishing at a hospital. A man in janitorial uniform similar to Cameron's morning attire. Two guys speaking Spanish, construction workers based on their boots and the paint spatters on their jeans. The invisible workforce moving through the city while everyone else slept. He transferred at State Street, waiting another 12 minutes for the northbound bus that would take him within walking distance of his apartment. The cold seeped through his jacket, and he paced to maintain circulation, checking his phone to avoid thinking about how much easier life would be with a car with reliable transportation. With any of the conveniences that required money, he'd never quite managed to accumulate. The second bus dropped him 4 blocks from home. He walked quickly, hands jammed in pockets, watching shadows and staying alert, because this neighborhood wasn't dangerous exactly, but wasn't safe either, existing in the gray zone where poverty and desperation sometimes manifested in ways that made Cameron grateful he had nothing worth stealing. A group of men stood outside a convenience store, passing a bottle in a brown bag, their laughter carrying through the quiet streets. Cameron kept his head down, walking with purpose, but not fear, projecting the confidence of someone who belonged here, who posed no threat and offered no opportunity. They ignored him, returning to their conversation as he passed. Murphy's Bar occupied a corner 2 blocks from his apartment. Cameron had never been inside, but he'd walked past it hundreds of times, noting the scarred wooden door and the neon sign that flickered more often than it glowed steadily. Tonight something made him pause. Maybe exhaustion had eroded his usual discipline. Maybe he wanted to delay arriving at an empty apartment where Lucas slept and nothing else waited. Maybe he just needed to sit somewhere that wasn't a bus or a desk or a couch that doubled as a bed. The bar smelled of stale beer and decades of cigarette smoke that had seeped into the walls despite smoking bans. A jukebox in the corner played something slow and bluesy music from a previous generation. Half a dozen patrons occupied stools at the bar, their postures suggesting regulars who came for the alcohol rather than the atmosphere. Cameron headed for the exit, almost immediately recognizing this as a mistake, a moment of weakness that wouldn't improve anything. Then he heard the voice, female slurred with alcohol, but trying to maintain authority. The sound came from a corner booth where 3 men leaned over someone Cameron couldn't quite see. Their body language suggested predators circling prey, that particular aggressive lean that preceded violence or something worse. The woman's voice again, sharper now, tinged with fear beneath the attempted firmness. The bartender watched but didn't intervene, expression suggesting he'd seen this play out before and had decided involvement wasn't worth the trouble. The other patrons maintained their studied indifference, eyes fixed on drinks or televisions mounted above the bar. Cameron felt something shift in his chest, an old instinct waking, despite the exhaustion, despite the knowledge that smart people didn't involve themselves in strangers' problems. He'd been raised to help, taught by parents who'd believed in community and responsibility values that felt outdated in a world that punished altruism more often than it rewarded it. But Rebecca had loved that about him, had married him partly because he couldn't walk past someone in the trouble without stopping. He moved toward the booth before conscious thought could override the impulse. The three men were college-age, probably mid-20s, wearing the expensive casual clothes of kids who'd never worried about rent or food. They had her boxed in against the wall, one hand on her shoulder, another reaching for her purse. The woman herself was maybe 40, wearing a business suit that had cost more than Cameron earned in a month. Her hair was professionally styled despite being disheveled, now makeup smeared from tears, or rubbing eyes unfocused in a way that suggested she'd had too much to drink. The situation required immediate intervention. Cameron stepped forward, positioning himself between the men and the woman, making his presence impossible to ignore. His voice came out steady despite adrenaline spiking through his system. "She's leaving with me. You need to back off." The largest of the three guys turned, sizing Cameron up with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a physical confrontation. He was bigger than Cameron by 20 pounds, younger by a decade, muscles evident beneath his designer shirt. But Cameron had 16 hours of work behind him, 3 years of physical labor that had stripped away anything soft and the kind of desperate edge that made him dangerous in ways these kids couldn't comprehend. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's not walking away. She's coming with me. You can let that happen, or we can have a problem." The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds. Cameron held eye contact, letting his exhaustion show. Because exhausted men were unpredictable, were capable of things that well-rested people thought through more carefully. The calculation happened behind the guy's eyes. Was this worth it? Was this woman worth fighting over? Were his friends committed enough to back him up if things turned physical? The answer came when the guy stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Whatever, man. She's all yours. Crazy bitch anyway." Cameron ignored the words, focusing on the woman who was trying to stand and failing. He slid into the booth, positioning himself beside her, creating a barrier between her and the men who were already moving toward the bar, their interest evaporating now that opposition had appeared. He kept one eye on them while assessing her condition. She was in bad shape. Eyes glassy, movements uncoordinated, speech slurred when she tried to speak. Whatever she'd consumed, it had hit her hard. Cameron scanned the table for her purse, finding it wedged between the seat and the wall, contents spilling out. He collected the items carefully: wallet, phone, keys, lipstick, tissues. The wallet fell open to reveal a driver's license with her photo. Vivian Harper, according to the ID. An address in Lincoln Park, one of Chicago's expensive neighborhoods, nowhere near this bar. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. Vivian Harper, CEO of Stellar Dynamics, the woman whose building he'd just left, whose company employed him to sit at a desk and watch engineers solve problems he could probably solve better. She had no idea who he was, wouldn't recognize the security guard she'd walked past hundreds of times without seeing. The irony was almost funny. "Can you tell me where you live? Do you have someone I can call to come get you?" Vivian tried to focus on his face, her eyes drifting before managing to lock onto his. The words that came out were barely coherent fragments about a meeting and a drink that became several drinks, and men who'd seemed nice until they weren't. She couldn't provide an address beyond Lincoln Park, couldn't remember her phone passcode, couldn't offer any useful information about how to get her home safely. Cameron weighed his options. Call 911, let the EMTs handle it, walk away without further involvement. But ambulances cost money, and if she was just drunk rather than in medical danger, he'd be condemning her to a $1,000 bill for what amounted to a ride home. Leave her here, let the bartender deal with it, trust that someone else would step up. Except he'd already seen how that played out, and those three guys might come back the moment he left. Take her to a hotel, get her a room, let her sleep it off in safety. Except hotels required credit cards and deposits, and her cards were in her wallet, and using someone else's credit card without permission crossed legal lines he wasn't willing to approach. That left one option, the option that violated every rule about getting involved, about maintaining boundaries, about protecting himself from situations that could be misinterpreted. But it was nearly 3 in the morning, she was in no condition to take care of herself, and walking away felt like abandoning the values Rebecca had loved about him. "Okay, listen, I'm going to get you somewhere safe. You're going to be fine. I need you to try to walk with me." He helped her stand, supporting most of her weight as they moved toward the door. The bartender watched without comment, and the three guys at the bar studiously ignored them. Cameron navigated her through the doorway and into the cold November air that hit her like a slap. She flinched, making a sound of protest, but the cold seemed to sharpen her awareness slightly. The 4 blocks to his apartment took 15 minutes. Vivian stumbled repeatedly, her expensive heels catching on sidewalk cracks, her weight shifting unpredictably against him. He held her upright through sheer determination, muscles burning from the effort, hyper-aware of every shadow and sound in case those men had decided to follow. But the streets remained empty except for the occasional passing car, and they reached his building without incident. 5 flights of stairs loomed ahead, and the elevator's out-of-order sign mocked him. He considered his options for approximately 3 seconds before accepting that there was no alternative. Vivian couldn't climb stairs in her condition. He'd have to carry her. "I'm going to pick you up now. Just relax." He positioned himself carefully, getting one arm behind her knees and another around her back, lifting with his legs to protect his already strained lower back. She was lighter than he'd expected, probably weighed about 120, her body going limp against him as he started climbing. The stairs seemed to multiply as he ascended each flight, requiring more effort than the last, his breathing growing labored by the 3rd floor. At the 5th floor, he paused to rest, setting her feet down while she leaned against the wall. His key required 3 tries because his hands were shaking from exertion, but finally the lock turned and he guided her into his apartment, praying Lucas hadn't woken. The apartment was dark and silent. Cameron navigated by memory, moving Vivian to the pull-out couch, lowering her carefully onto cushions that were lumpy but clean. She immediately curled onto her side, making small sounds of discomfort, eyes already closing. He grabbed the spare blanket from the closet covering her, then stood back to assess what he'd just done. He'd brought the CEO of Stellar Dynamics to his apartment. The woman who signed his paychecks without knowing his name was now unconscious on his couch, vulnerable and trusting in a way that could destroy both their lives if anyone discovered this situation. The potential for misunderstanding was staggering. If she woke confused, if she accused him of anything, if she told anyone about this night, his explanation would sound exactly like what a guilty person would say. But leaving her hadn't been an option, and nothing about the situation could be changed now. He filled a glass with water, set it on the coffee table within her reach. It added 2 aspirin beside it. Then he checked Lucas one more time, finding his son still sleeping peacefully, blissfully unaware of the chaos his father had introduced into their carefully controlled existence. Cameron sat in the kitchen, head in his hands, trying to process the sequence of decisions that had led to this moment. The smart thing would have been to walk past that bar, to ignore the woman's voice, to prioritize his own safety over her welfare. But he'd stopped being the smart version of himself 3 years ago when Rebecca died. Or maybe earlier, when he'd sacrificed his career to care for her, choosing love over practicality, choosing presence over future security. The exhaustion that had been building all day crashed over him like a wave. His body demanded sleep, but his mind spun through scenarios and possibilities and consequences. He needed to be awake when she woke, needed to explain the situation before confusion could breed accusations. He needed to get her home safely without anyone seeing her leave his apartment. He needed to contain this situation before it exploded into something that cost him everything. But first, he needed to do what he always did during these stolen hours between shifts. He needed to draw, to engage the part of himself that felt real, to prove that Cameron Wells, the engineer, still existed. Even when Cameron Wells, the security guard, was making catastrophically poor decisions about helping strangers. He retrieved his notebook from beneath the couch cushions, careful not to disturb Vivian, and carried it to the kitchen. The inventory system designs waited unfinished problems that demanded solutions. He opened to a fresh page and began calculating the modified servo array that would handle asymmetric loads, the challenge he'd been wrestling with for weeks. The pencil moved across paper, each line precise, each calculation verified. The servo motors needed variable speed control to prevent oscillation under dynamic loads. He sketched the control algorithm, breaking down the feedback loop into discrete steps that a microcontroller could execute in real time. The pressure sensor would be mounted at strategic points, providing data about load distribution, feeding that information back to adjust motor speeds individually rather than as a group. He worked until his eyes burned, until the numbers on the page began to blur, until checking the clock revealed it was 4:38, and he'd been drawing for over an hour. The design was nearly complete, maybe 3 or 4 more sessions away from being ready for prototyping, if he'd had access to equipment, if anyone cared about the engineering solutions being developed in a security guard's kitchen during hours that should have been spent sleeping. Cameron closed the notebook and allowed himself to lie down on the floor beside the couch using a throw pillow as inadequate cushioning. His body was beyond exhaustion, now operating on fumes and stubborn refusal to stop. But even as sleep pulled at him, part of his mind continued working on the servo array problem, refining calculations, imagining how the system would function in practice. He dreamed of mechanisms and mathematics of systems that worked perfectly because he'd designed them that way, of a version of himself that still mattered in ways beyond keeping Lucas fed and the rent paid. Then he dreamed of Rebecca, her smile in those early days before the cancer, her voice saying his name, with the affection of someone who saw him clearly and loved what she saw. The dream shifted, became darker, her hospital room, and machines that beeped urgently, and doctors speaking in low voices about time running out. Movement jerked him awake. His eyes opened to gray morning light filtering through windows, his body stiff from sleeping on the floor, his neck aching from the awkward angle. Vivian sat upright on the couch blanket, clutched to her chest, eyes wide with the confusion of someone trying to assemble reality from fragments. Cameron pushed himself up slowly, every muscle protesting, trying not to startle her. Their eyes met, and he watched panic flash across her face as recognition failed, as she realized she was somewhere unfamiliar with someone she didn't know. Her hand moved to her temple, fingers pressing against what was certainly a vicious hangover. The words came carefully pitched to be reassuring rather than threatening. "It's okay, you're safe, I'm Cameron. We were at Murphy's bar last night. You had some trouble with some guys and I helped. You couldn't remember where you lived, so I brought you here, that's all." He gestured to the water glass on the coffee table. "There's aspirin, you'll probably want both." Vivian stared at him for a long moment, her eyes moving from his face to the apartment around them. He tried to see the space through her perspective, the cramped dimensions barely larger than her office, the mismatched furniture salvaged from curbsides and thrift stores, the water stain on the ceiling that had spread another 3 inches since summer, the absence of anything decorative or unnecessary, the evidence of poverty in every corner. She reached for the water with shaking hands, downing the aspirin and half the glass in desperate gulps. When she spoke, her voice carried the rasp of alcohol and disrupted sleep. "Thank you, I don't remember much, just fragments." A pause, then pieces of memory seeming to return. "There were men. They were being aggressive. I encouraged them to leave. They did. Then you needed somewhere safe." Vivian checked herself discreetly, confirming that her clothes were intact, that nothing inappropriate had occurred. Cameron understood the necessity of the gesture and didn't take offense. Satisfied that she was unharmed beyond the hangover, she looked around again, this time with different intent. Her gaze was observant now, analytical, taking in details with the focus of someone whose profession demanded reading situations accurately. Her eyes lingered on Lucas's backpack near the door, the small sneakers lined up neatly beneath it, evidence of the child Cameron hadn't mentioned. Then her attention moved to the kitchen, its sparse contents visible through open cabinet doors, generic cereal, canned goods, nothing fresh or expensive. Finally, her gaze caught on something that made her expression shift entirely. The notebook had slipped partially out from beneath the couch cushions during the night. Technical drawings were visible, precise lines and calculations that clearly weren't random doodling. Cameron followed her gaze, his chest tightening with recognition of what she was seeing, of how this situation was about to become infinitely more complicated. Before he could speak, before he could deflect or distract, Lucas emerged from his room in wrinkled pajamas, hair sticking up in directions that suggested restless sleep. The boy stopped immediately upon seeing the stranger on their couch, eyes going wide with surprise rather than fear, because Lucas had been raised to be cautious, but not paranoid, to assess situations before reacting. Cameron put himself between his son and Vivian, instinctively, a gesture of protection that was probably unnecessary but felt mandatory. "It's okay, buddy. This lady needed help last night. She'll be leaving soon." Lucas nodded slowly, processing the information with the seriousness that 8-year-olds applied to unexpected situations. His eyes remained fixed on Vivian with unfiltered curiosity, the kind of direct stare that adults learn to soften with social conditioning. "Is she okay, Dad?" "She's fine. Go get breakfast started. I'll be there in a minute." Lucas hesitated, clearly wanting to ask more questions, clearly trying to understand why there was a woman in their apartment at what the kitchen clock showed was 6:47 in the morning. But he obeyed, moving toward the kitchen, and Cameron heard him pulling out the cereal box, the refrigerator door, opening the morning routine they'd perfected over 3 years, clicking into familiar motion despite the disruption. Vivian watched with an expression Cameron couldn't quite read, something between surprise and recognition, as if she were seeing something unexpected that explained other things. When she spoke, her voice had softened. "You have a son." The statement wasn't a question. "Lucas, he's 8." Cameron kept his tone neutral, uncertain where this conversation was heading, wanting only to get her safely home before the situation developed new complications. "I should call you a cab. Or do you need me to contact someone, family, friends, someone who can come get you?" Vivian didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood slowly, steadying herself against the couch arm, testing her balance. She was shorter than Cameron had realized the previous night, her head barely reaching his shoulder, even in the heels she'd somehow not lost. But something about her posture suggested command, the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, despite her current circumstances. She walked toward where the notebook had slipped out, and before Cameron could stop her, she picked it up. Her eyes scanned the visible page, and he watched them widen with recognition, with shock, with something that might have been excitement. All traces of hangover confusion vanished from her expression. "Did you draw this?" The question came sharp, focused, every word deliberate. Cameron moved quickly, taking the notebook from her hands with more firmness than politeness. The gesture was protective, instinctive, safeguarding something precious, even though rational thought said these designs were worthless, were fantasy, were the private refuge of someone whose real work involved mops and delivery bags and security desks. "Just doodling. Let me get that cab for you." He shoved the notebook back under the cushions, but her eyes followed its trajectory, then returned to his face with uncomfortable intensity. "That wasn't doodling. That was an automated inventory system." "I've seen designs like that before. My company's engineering team has been working on something similar for 8 months, and they can't get the load distribution right." She stepped closer, and Cameron instinctively stepped back, suddenly aware of how small the apartment was, how little space existed between them, how cornered he felt despite being in his own home. "The solution you drew there with the distributed servo array and pressure-sensitive feedback loop, that's exactly what they need." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications Cameron didn't want to explore. This was spiraling beyond his control, entering territory that felt dangerous in ways he couldn't articulate. He needed her to leave, needed to restore the separation between her world and his, needed to return to the anonymity that protected him from hopes that would only lead to disappointment. "I was just passing time. Please let me call you a ride. Where do you need to go? Where do you work?" Her question cut through his deflection, direct and unavoidable. "Several jobs, cleaning delivery security at night." Which building? Cameron closed his eyes briefly, recognizing that honesty was the only option left, that lying would be discovered immediately and make everything worse. Stellar Dynamics, evening shift. The silence that followed was absolute. When he opened his eyes, Vivian's expression had transformed completely, shock giving way to something like understanding, pieces clicking together in her mind. "My name is Vivian Harper. I'm the CEO of Stellar Dynamics." The confirmation of what he'd already known still hit like a punch. Cameron felt the room tilt, felt reality rearranging itself into patterns he hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. This was worse than he'd imagined, more complicated than simple kindness toward a stranger. He'd saved his employer, brought her to his apartment, and now she'd discovered his secret, the part of himself he'd kept hidden, because revealing it meant risking hope, and hope was more dangerous than despair. "I need to call you that cab." "Now, wait, please." Vivian sat on the couch, deliberately making herself less threatening, less imposing, creating physical space that might reduce the tension crackling between them. "Those drawings. Where did you learn to do that?" Cameron remained standing, every instinct screaming to end this conversation, to extract her from his life before the situation became more tangled. "It doesn't matter. It matters because that design solves my team's problem. They've been working on automated inventory systems for our warehouse facilities. The load distribution keeps causing oscillation. Motors fail under stress. Your solution with a distributed array and individual feedback control, that could work." From the kitchen, Lucas had stopped eating. Cameron could feel his son's attention, could sense the boy listening to every word, trying to understand why this strange woman was talking about his father's drawings, why there was intensity in the air that made even an 8-year-old recognize significance. I was an engineer. The words came out harder than intended, almost aggressive. Mechanical engineering. Baxter Technologies, 6 years a lead engineer on automation projects. He paused, the next part requiring more effort because it meant exposing wounds that hadn't healed, that probably never would. Then my wife got sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to death. I quit to take care of her and Lucas. Used everything we had for treatment. When she died, I had a 5-year-old, no savings medical debt that will follow me forever and a resume gap nobody wanted to explain. The confession hung between them raw and ugly, the truth he'd spent 3 years trying to outrun through constant motion and relentless work. Vivian's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for Cameron to identify, finally settling into something that looked like genuine concern mixed with calculation. How long have you been at Stellar? 3 years. Security desk evening shift. The answer came flat, empty of inflection. I see you sometimes walking through the lobby. You never look at security guards. Nobody does. I should have looked. The admission sounded sincere, but Cameron had learned that sincerity was cheap, that people said what sounded good without committing to meaningful change. I want to see more of your designs, all of them. No, the word came out sharper than he'd intended, but softening it would suggest negotiation was possible. I don't need charity. I helped you because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted something. This isn't charity. This is business. You have skills my company needs. That inventory system alone could save us millions in operational costs. Your solution to the load distribution problem is elegant, impractical. I want to offer you a position in our engineering department. The offer should have felt like vindication, like the universe finally recognizing his worth, like everything he'd sacrificed had led to this moment of redemption. Instead, it felt like a trap, like accepting would mean owing debts he couldn't repay. Like hope was being offered by someone who'd forget her promises the moment the guilt of last night faded. You'll forget this in a week. The hangover will clear, and you'll remember I'm just the security guard who sits at a desk you walk past. This is gratitude talking, not genuine recognition. And when the gratitude wears off, I'll still be here working 3 DOS, and you'll still be walking past without seeing me. Vivian stood, closing some of the distance between them, her voice gaining the authority that probably served her well in boardrooms and negotiations. I'm offering you an opportunity based on your demonstrated skills. Yes, the circumstances are unusual. Yes, I wish I'd noticed you before last night. But that doesn't change the fact that you're talented, that my company needs what you can provide, that you deserve better than scrubbing toilets and delivering food and checking badges at a desk. The rational part of Cameron's mind understood she was right, that refusing meant choosing pride over practical improvement in his and Lucas's lives. But the wounded part, the part that had learned to expect disappointment, that had been rejected by every engineering firm in Chicago, that had been ground down by 3 years of invisibility, couldn't accept that change was possible. I have to get ready for my morning shift. I appreciate the offer, but no. Please let me call you that cab. He moved to his phone, pulling up a rideshare app, fingers trembling slightly as he entered her address from memory of the license he'd seen last night. The car would arrive in 7 minutes. 7 minutes until she left, and this impossible situation ended, and life returned to its normal pattern of work and exhaustion and survival. Vivian collected her purse, checked that everything was inside, ran fingers through her hair in a futile attempt to restore order. She looked at Cameron with an expression he couldn't interpret, something between frustration and understanding, between disappointment and resignation. Lucas had emerged from the kitchen, standing in the hallway, watching them both with the perception children had for reading adult emotions. His small voice broke the silence. "Dad, you should listen to her. You're always drawing every night." "I hear you. Even when you think I'm asleep, I hear the pencil on paper." "You look happy then. You don't look happy any other time. If she wants to see them, maybe you should show her. Maybe something good could happen." The words cracked something inside Cameron's chest, splintering the protective walls he'd built around his heart, around his hopes, around the possibility that life could be more than survival. Lucas deserved better than a father who worked himself to death, who sacrificed everything without allowing room for unexpected opportunities, who taught by example that dreams belonged in notebooks rather than reality. He looked at his son's hopeful face at Vivian, standing with a professional composure, despite the chaos of the previous night at the apartment that represented everything he'd lost and hadn't managed to regain. The decision felt impossible, felt like choosing between safe misery and risky hope, between protecting himself and protecting Lucas from disappointment, if this all fell apart. Fine. The word came out reluctant, almost hostile. But not here. Lucas needs to get to school. I have a shift. If you're serious about this, we can meet later, 3 o'clock. I'll bring the notebooks. All of them. But I need guarantees. A real interview, not charity dressed up as opportunity. Professional evaluation of my work, not sympathy for my circumstances. Vivian pulled out her phone, fingers moving across the screen with practiced speed, despite the hangover that must still be pounding behind her eyes. Give me your number. I'll text you the address. Cameron rattled off the digits, watching her type, feeling the weight of the decision settle into his bones. His phone buzzed moments later with a message containing an address he recognized: Stellar Dynamics headquarters, 20th floor executive offices. The location where decisions happened, where his fate would be determined by people who'd probably never struggled, who'd probably never understood what it meant to choose between pride and survival. Thank you for last night, for this morning, for taking a chance. Vivian's voice had softened, whilst the CEO authority sounded almost vulnerable. I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm going to show you this isn't charity or guilt, or anything except recognition of what you can do. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her, leaving Cameron alone with Lucas and the magnitude of what had just happened. His son approached, wrapping arms around him in a hug that felt like absolution, like permission to hope, like forgiveness for all the times Cameron hadn't been present because work consumed everything. Are you really going to show her your drawings? Yeah, buddy, I guess I am. Lucas pulled back, grinning with the unfiltered joy of children who hadn't yet learned that hope could be weaponized, that opportunities could be traps, that the universe sometimes offered what you wanted only to snatch it away. I'm proud of you, Dad. Mom would be proud too. The mention of Rebecca hit harder than expected, bringing tears that Cameron forced back through sheer will. He knelt down to Lucas's level, looking his son directly in the eyes, needing him to understand the truth beneath the hope. This might not work out. She might decide I'm not good enough, or that the situation is too complicated, or that she made a mistake. If that happens, we'll be okay. We've been okay this whole time, right? We have each other, and that's what matters. But maybe it will work out. Maybe she's telling the truth. Maybe you'll get to be an engineer again, and I'll get to have a dad who doesn't look sad all the time. The simple observation carried more weight than any complex argument. Lucas had been watching, had been understanding more than Cameron gave him credit for, had been carrying his own burdens silently because his father was too busy surviving to notice. The guilt was crushing, was overwhelming, was another reminder that his choices had consequences beyond himself. Maybe. I'll try. Okay, I'll go to the meeting. Show her the work. See what happens. But whatever happens, I love you. That doesn't change. I know, Dad. I love you too. Cameron stood, checked the time, realized he had 40 minutes before his cleaning shift started, and no time to process what had just happened. He moved through the mechanical routine, checking that Lucas had everything for school, leaving the morning note even though they'd already talked, gathering his own work clothes, trying to quiet the storm of thoughts threatening to paralyze him. The possibility of change felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. 3 years of stasis, of accepting that this was his life now, of abandoning dreams in favor of immediate survival, had created patterns so deep that imagining different ones seemed impossible. But Lucas's words echoed in his mind. The observation that Cameron looked sad all the time, except when he was drawing, when his mind engaged with problems that mattered, when he remembered who he'd been before circumstances had stripped away everything except the core will to keep going. He left the apartment at 7:30, descended the 5 flights because the elevator remained broken, emerged into November cold that felt sharper than usual, as if the world itself had become more vivid overnight. The bus arrived on time, carrying him downtown to the office building, where people who'd never struggled would soon arrive to occupy spaces Cameron cleaned, leaving behind the detritus of productive lives while he remained invisible except for the evidence of his labor. The work proceeded mechanically, his body going through familiar motions, while his mind spun through scenarios and possibilities. Meeting Vivian at 3 o'clock meant bringing the notebooks, meant exposing years of private work to professional evaluation, meant risking rejection that would hurt worse than the rejections he'd received 3 years ago, because this time he'd allowed himself to hope. The fear of disappointment battled against the fragile possibility that maybe impossibly Lucas was right. Maybe something good could happen. He finished the cleaning shift, moved to the lunch delivery position, pedaled through Chicago streets, with his mind elsewhere, earning tips that mattered less than usual because the prospect of real employment made $93 feel simultaneously crucial and insufficient. Lucas's text about the math test brought momentary grounding pride in his son's accomplishment, cutting through the anxiety about the afternoon meeting. By 2:45, Cameron stood outside Stellar Dynamics headquarters, backpack heavy with 7 notebooks that represented 3 years of secret engineering, of maintaining his identity as someone who could create, of refusing to let circumstances completely define him. The revolving doors gleamed with afternoon sunlight, and beyond them lay either vindication or another crushing reminder that people like him didn't get second chances. He pushed through the doors, entering the building where he'd worked as invisible labor for 3 years, where executives and engineers moved through spaces without acknowledging his existence. Jerome sat at the security desk, looking up with confusion that quickly shifted to concern. "Cameron, what are you doing here? You're not scheduled until 6. I have a meeting with Miss Harper." With the CEO. Jerome's expression suggested Cameron had claimed a meeting with the president, disbelief and skepticism mixing into something close to pity. Vivian emerged from the elevator before Cameron could respond, wearing a sharp charcoal suit that erased all evidence of the previous night's chaos. Her hair was perfectly styled makeup, flawless, every inch the executive who commanded respect and authority. She spotted Cameron immediately, her expression shifting into something warm, something that almost looked like relief. "Miss Wells, thank you for coming. Follow me." She led him past Jerome's stunned expression, past the lobby where Cameron had sat hundreds of nights, watching people who never saw him, into an elevator that rose smoothly to the 20th floor. Neither spoke during the ascent, the silence heavy with anticipation and unspoken questions. The doors opened onto executive offices that Cameron had only seen during late-night rounds, spaces that gleamed with expensive furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering views of Chicago that seemed designed to remind occupants of their elevated position. Vivian's corner office was larger than Cameron's entire apartment. Windows on 2 walls provided panoramic views of the city, the lake visible in the distance, sunlight streaming across a desk that probably cost more than he earned in 6 months. She didn't sit behind that desk, didn't create the power dynamic that seating arrangements usually enforced. Instead, she gestured to a leather couch near the windows and sat beside him, closing distance, creating intimacy that felt deliberate. "Did you bring them?" Cameron pulled the 7 notebooks from his backpack, spiral-bound records of 3 years lived in the margins of exhaustion. Each one was worn pages bent from being stuffed under couch cushions, covers water-stained from the bicycle deliveries where rain had soaked through his bag. He set them on the coffee table between them, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been vulnerable since Rebecca's funeral, exposed in a way that felt both terrifying and necessary. Vivian opened the first notebook, her eyes moving across pages with the focus of someone trained to evaluate technical work. Cameron watched her expression change from professional interest to surprise to something approaching awe. She flipped through pages quickly at first, then slowed, taking time to study individual designs, tracing calculations with her finger, nodding at solutions that clearly resonated with her understanding of engineering challenges. "This is extraordinary." She looked up at him, and the sincerity in her eyes felt genuine rather than performative. "These aren't just good ideas. These are revolutionary solutions to problems my engineers can't solve. This waste heat recovery system could reduce our manufacturing energy costs by 30%. This robotic assembly modification increases precision while cutting production time. This supply chain optimization uses publicly available data about our operations to identify inefficiencies we haven't recognized." The validation should have felt satisfying, should have confirmed that his skills remained sharp, despite 3 years away from formal engineering. Instead, it amplified his awareness of waste of talent, squandered of time lost to survival, when it could have been applied to creation. 3 years of drawing in notebooks while the world moved forward without him while technologies evolved and his knowledge became increasingly outdated, while younger engineers built careers he should have been building. Those are just concepts. Theory without implementation means nothing. Vivian closed the notebook, her expression shifting into something more calculated, more strategic. I want to offer you a position in our engineering department. Senior engineer, possibly lead, depending on how you perform. Full benefits, competitive salary. I want to give you the chance nobody else would. The offer hung in the air, and Cameron felt everything inside him pull in different directions. The opportunity he'd been denied for 3 years, presented casually, as if it were simple, as if circumstances hadn't irreversibly changed him, as if accepting wouldn't mean owing debts he couldn't quantify. Lucas's face appeared in his mind, the boy's words about maybe something good happening, about deserving to look happy. But beneath the hope lay fear so profound it threatened to paralyze him. Fear of failing, of proving everyone right who'd rejected him, of discovering that the gap in his resume had indeed destroyed his capabilities. Fear of accepting charity disguised as recognition, of becoming someone's redemption project, of losing the small dignity he'd maintained by refusing handouts. Fear of hoping when hope had proven itself to be the cruelest form of torture, promising futures that evaporated when examined closely. No, the word came out before conscious thought could intervene, defensive walls snapping into place. I appreciate the offer, but no. Vivian's surprise was evident. Why not? Because you feel obligated. Because last night happened, and now you think you owe me something. I don't want a job from a guilt or pity. I want to be hired because I'm qualified, not because I saved you from a bad situation. The accusation landed harder than he'd intended, but softening it would suggest negotiation was possible. He needed her to understand that accepting this offer meant accepting all the baggage that came with it, all the whispers about how he'd gotten the position, all the doubt about whether he'd earned it or been given it. This isn't pity. Vivian's voice gained steel, the executive emerging beneath the warmth. I have shareholders. I have a board. If I bring you on, it's because you're worth it to the company, not because I'm trying to ease my conscience. Then why now? Cameron leaned forward, anger mixing with desperation. Why not 6 months ago? A year? Why didn't you notice me when I sat at that security desk every night for 3 years? You have walked past me hundreds of times. The only reason you're seeing me now, the only reason these notebooks matter to you is because of last night. That's circumstance, not merit. The truth of his words seemed to hit her, creating visible impact. She opened her mouth to respond, closed it, searching for arguments that wouldn't sound hollow. Finally, she spoke with the honesty he'd demanded. You're right. I should have seen you before. I should have looked at the people working in my building, should have recognized that talent can exist anywhere, should have been better. But does that mean Lucas should keep living in an apartment with water damage because I didn't notice you sooner? Does your pride matter more than giving your son a better life? The invocation of Lucas felt like a manipulation, like using his son as leverage to force a decision Cameron wasn't ready to make. Anger flared hot, an immediate protective instinct, overwhelming rational thought. Don't use my son to manipulate me. Don't pretend you care about his welfare when you're just trying to absolve your own guilt. You want to feel good about yourself? Want to tell stories at fundraisers about the security guard you saved? Want to be the hero in a narrative that makes you look generous rather than oblivious? That's not fair. Fair Cameron stood pacing because sitting felt like surrendering ground. You want to talk about fair would be getting hired 3 years ago when I applied to 18 different engineering firms with a resume that proved my capabilities. Fair would be having my wife survive, having the chance to keep my career, having a life where I don't work 16-hour days and still can't afford decent shoes for my son. You don't get to lecture me about fairness when you've never struggled, when you've never had to choose between pride and survival, when the worst thing that's happened to you recently is getting drunk at a bar. The words came out cruel, designed to hurt, carrying 3 years of accumulated rage at a system that punished vulnerability and rewarded those born into advantage. He knew he was being unfair to her, knew his anger was misdirected, knew she was offering something genuine. But accepting meant vulnerability, meant risking hope, meant potentially facing another devastating rejection when this opportunity inevitably evaporated. Vivian stood as well, her own anger rising to meet his. You think you're the only one who struggled. You think success means someone handed me everything? I was a single mother working 2 jobs and taking night classes, living in an apartment smaller than yours, wondering every day if I could keep going. Someone took a chance on me when I hadn't earned it yet, when my resume was full of gaps and my background was wrong for the industry. That person changed my life. And maybe I've been blind. Maybe I've been exactly the kind of executive I swore I'd never become. But I'm trying to do better now. I'm trying to give you the same chance someone gave me. The revelation shifted something, creating a connection Cameron hadn't anticipated. She understood, maybe not completely, but enough to recognize the weight he carried, the fear that accepting help meant accepting judgment, the impossible choice between pride and practicality. In 6 months, when the guilt wears off, where will I be? The question came quieter now, exhaustion replacing anger. I'll have given up jobs that kept us afloat. I'll have bet everything on your good intentions. And when you decide this was a mistake, when your board questions the wisdom of hiring a security guard with a 3-year gap, when people start wondering about the circumstances that led to this offer, you'll let me go. At least now I'm in control. At least now I know what to expect. You think you're in control? Vivian's voice had softened, too matching his change in tone. You're working yourself to death. You're surviving, not living. You're teaching Lucas that this is all life can be, that dreams belong in notebooks, and reality means accepting whatever scraps the world offers. That's not control. That's surrender. The accusation hit because it was true, because Lucas had already observed that his father only looked happy when drawing, because 3 years of survival had eroded any sense of possibility beyond the immediate. But admitting that meant admitting defeat, meant acknowledging that his choices had harmed his son, meant accepting responsibility for circumstances that had felt entirely beyond his control. I'm not afraid. I'm realistic. The defense sounded weak even to his own ears. People like you don't actually care about people like me, except when it makes you feel good about yourselves. I'm not your redemption project. Vivian closed the distance between them, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. I'm not offering redemption. I'm offering opportunity. But if you're determined to believe the worst, if you're committed to this narrative where nobody can be trusted and every kindness is secretly manipulation, then fine. Walk away. Go back to your 3 jobs and your notebooks full of designs nobody will ever see. But don't pretend it's about protecting Lucas. You're protecting yourself. You're too scared to hope, because hoping hurts more than resignation. The words cut deep, exposing truths Cameron had been avoiding. He was scared. Terrified, actually. Scared that accepting would mean owing debts he couldn't repay, that failing would prove all the rejection letters right, that hoping would make the eventual disappointment unbearable. Better to refuse now, to maintain control, to live with known misery, than risk unknown devastation. I need to go. He moved toward the door, hand reaching for the handle, every instinct screaming to flee, before the situation inflicted more damage. Vivian's voice stopped him before he could turn the knob. When I woke up this morning, you know what I saw. A man who'd given up everything for people he loved. A man who worked 3 jobs without complaining. A man who still helped a stranger when he was exhausted. And notebooks full of genius the world was too blind to recognize. That's what I'm offering, Cameron. Not pity, recognition, the chance to be seen for what you are. What am I? He turned back, genuinely wanting to hear her answer, needing to understand how she could see value he'd long since stopped believing existed. Extraordinary. You're extraordinary, and you deserve a chance to prove it. The sincerity in her voice broke through his defenses, creating cracks in the protective walls he'd built over 3 years of disappointment and rejection. Lucas's hopeful face appeared in his mind again. His son's request that maybe his father deserved to be happy, deserved to use his skills, deserved more than survival. Rebecca's voice echoed too, her belief that Cameron was capable of remarkable things, her pride when he'd solved problems others couldn't, her encouragement to never stop creating. If I do this, the words came slowly, testing each one before committing, I need guarantees. A contract that protects me if this doesn't work out. Enough time to prove myself without the sword of firing hanging over my head. Complete transparency about expectations and evaluation criteria. I won't be anyone's diversity hire or feel-good story. If I do this, it's because I'm actually qualified, because my work stands on its own merit. Agreed. Vivian moved back to her desk, pulling out a legal pad, beginning to write. 6-month probationary period with clear performance metrics. Full evaluation based solely on work quality, not circumstances or backstory. Fair compensation from day one, not some reduced rate because you're learning. If the board questions this hire, I'll present your work and let it speak for itself. You'll sink or swim based on your abilities, not my charity. Why does this matter so much to you? Cameron needed to understand her motivation, needed to believe this was genuine rather than elaborate performance of generosity. Vivian set down her pen looking at him with the vulnerability of someone sharing truths usually kept private. Because 12 years ago I was drowning. Single mother with a 6-year-old working as an administrative assistant during the day and waitressing at night taking online classes I could barely stay awake through. The CEO of a tech startup came into the restaurant and I accidentally spilled coffee on him. I was so tired I couldn't even apologize correctly. He should have complained to my manager, gotten me fired. Instead, he came back the next week, asked about my life, learned I was studying business and engineering. He offered me an entry-level position at his company, even though I was completely unqualified. Said he saw potential nobody else had bothered to notice. She paused, emotion crossing her face before being controlled back into professional composure. That man changed my life, gave me the chance to learn, to grow, to prove what I could do. He died 5 years ago, and I've been looking for a way to pay forward what he gave me. But it's not just charity, Cameron. It's not even primarily about redemption. It's about recognizing that our current system is broken, that we're wasting talent because we only look in traditional places, because we let circumstances define potential rather than seeing what people can actually do. The honesty in her confession felt genuine, felt like the kind of truth people didn't share unless they meant it. Cameron looked at the notebooks on the coffee table, 3 years of private work proof that he'd never stopped being an engineer, even when the world insisted he was something less. He thought about Lucas, about teaching his son that giving up was safer than trying, that resignation was wiser than hope. He thought about Rebecca, about what she'd say if she could see him now refusing an opportunity because pride and fear had become more comfortable than possibility. Okay, the word came out barely above a whisper, but once spoken, it couldn't be recalled. I'll do it, but I need 2 weeks' notice at my other jobs. They've been good to me, and I won't leave them scrambling. And I need to explain this to Lucas carefully. He needs to understand this might not work out, that we have to be prepared for disappointment. It will work out. Vivian's confidence felt like a promise she intended to keep. I'll send the contract details to your phone tonight. We'll formalize everything in writing before you give notice anywhere. Welcome to Stellar Dynamics, Cameron, as an engineer this time. She extended her hand. Cameron took it, feeling the firmness of her grip, the realness of this moment that felt simultaneously too good to be true and too real to be dismissed as fantasy. He'd just agreed to bet everything on the word of someone he barely knew, to risk the fragile stability he'd built to hope, despite every lesson teaching him that hope was dangerous. He left her office with the notebooks back in his backpack, descended in the elevator that had carried him countless times while he worked. Security emerged into the lobby, where Jerome watched with undisguised confusion. The afternoon sunlight felt different somehow, sharper or brighter, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. Cameron pulled out his phone, typed a message to Lucas that school wouldn't see for another hour. Something happened today, something that might change things. I love you. We'll talk tonight. Then he walked toward the bus stop, toward his delivery shift that suddenly felt less permanent, toward an evening where he'd need to explain to his 8-year-old son that maybe impossibly their lives were about to transform. The fear remained, the doubt hadn't vanished, the knowledge that this could all fall apart still hung over everything. But beneath the fear and doubt lay something else, something fragile and tentative and dangerous: hope. The possibility that Cameron Wells, the engineer, wasn't dead, just dormant. The chance that extraordinary things could come from ordinary places, that second acts existed, that one person's recognition could rewrite futures that seemed fixed. He boarded the bus, found a seat near the back, and pulled out his phone to review the message Vivian had already sent: contract terms, salary figures that made his chest tighten, benefits that included health care and retirement contributions, and things he'd stopped letting himself imagine. The numbers felt surreal, representing more than survival for the first time in 3 years, suggesting a future where Lucas could have new shoes without Cameron calculating which bill to pay late. The ride downtown passed in a blur of thoughts and calculations and cautious optimism. By the time he reached the bicycle depot to start his delivery shift, Cameron had made the decision to believe. To trust that Vivian meant what she'd said, that his work was genuinely valuable, that maybe the universe occasionally offered second chances to people who'd been knocked down but refused to stay there. The afternoon deliveries proceeded mechanically, his body going through familiar motions, while his mind remained in Vivian's office, replaying the conversation, analyzing her words for hidden warnings, searching for reasons to doubt while trying to believe. 17 deliveries by 6 o'clock, $112, earning money that suddenly felt like the end of something rather than indefinite continuation. He finished the delivery shift and rode to his apartment, needing to be there when Lucas arrived home, needing to share this news with the one person whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's. The 5 flights of stairs felt less oppressive tonight, exhaustion diminished by adrenaline and possibility. Lucas was already home, sitting at his desk, with homework spread across the Surface pencil, moving across paper with the careful precision Rebecca had also possessed. He looked up when Cameron entered, eyes bright with questions. "Did you show her your drawings?" Cameron sat on his son's bed, gesturing for Lucas to join him. The boy abandoned his homework, immediately settling beside his father, with the trust children gave when they believed their parents would protect them from harm. Cameron took a breath, trying to find words that would convey hope without over-promising, that would prepare Lucas for possible disappointment while not crushing the boy's optimism. "I showed her. She looked at all of them, all 7 notebooks, and she said they were good. Really good. She offered me a job as an engineer at her company." Lucas's face lit up with joy so pure it hurt to witness. "That's amazing, Dad. That's amazing. You're going to be an engineer again." "Maybe." Cameron tempered the celebration, needing Lucas to understand reality. "We have to be careful. This might not work out. Her board of directors might not approve. My skills might not be as current as they need to be. Other engineers might not want someone like me joining their team. We have to prepare for the possibility that this doesn't last, but it might work out." Lucas's optimism refused to be dimmed. "You're really good at engineering. You fix everything. You solve every problem. If she's smart, she'll see that." The simple faith his son placed in him felt like both gift and burden, like responsibility to live up to expectations while knowing that failure would disappoint more than just himself. Cameron pulled Lucas into a hug, holding his son close, breathing in the scent of school and childhood, and innocence that wouldn't last forever. "I'm going to try. I'm going to work as hard as I can to make this succeed. But no matter what happens, we're going to be okay. We've survived everything else. We'll survive this too if it doesn't work out. It's going to work out. I know it is. Mom's watching and she'll make sure it works out." The mention of Rebecca brought tears. Cameron didn't fight this time, letting them fall silently while Lucas remained pressed against his chest. Maybe Rebecca was watching. Maybe she'd be proud that he was taking this chance, that he was trying to build something better for their son, that he hadn't completely surrendered to circumstances. Or maybe she'd be furious that he'd risked their stability, that he'd trusted someone he barely knew, that he'd allowed hope to override caution. Either way, the decision was made. Tomorrow he'd give notice at the cleaning company, and the delivery service informed them professionally but firmly that he'd found other employment. The security position would be the hardest to leave because 3 years had created familiarity, had given him identity and routine, even if that identity was limited and the routine was exhausting. But Frank would understand, might even be happy for him, might recognize that people deserve chances to use their full capabilities rather than accepting whatever work would have them. That night after Lucas was asleep, Cameron sat at the kitchen table with his newest notebook, not drawing new designs, but reviewing what he had already created, seeing his work through the eyes of someone who just offered him professional validation. The automated inventory system was good, genuinely good, the kind of innovation that solved real problems elegantly. The waste heat recovery system demonstrated understanding of thermodynamics and practical engineering. The supply chain optimization showed analytical thinking and pattern recognition. He'd spent 3 years believing these designs were fantasy private refuge from reality, worthless, except as mental exercise. But maybe they had been preparation maintaining skills that would otherwise have atrophied, keeping himself ready for a chance he'd stopped believing would come. Maybe the 3 years hadn't been wasted after all, had been necessary foundation for whatever came next. His phone buzzed with a message from Vivian. Contract attached. Review with lawyer if desired. Let me know if you have questions. Looking forward to working with you. The attachment was a PDF 15 pages of legal language that Cameron would need to read carefully provisions about probationary periods and performance metrics and termination conditions. But the salary figure jumped out immediately, $75,000 annually, more than he'd earned at Baxter, more than seemed possible after 3 years of poverty wages. With benefits and retirement contributions, the total compensation approached $90,000, a number that felt like fiction. He read through the contract twice, finding nothing that seemed exploitative or unfair, nothing that triggered the paranoia he'd developed about being taken advantage of. The terms were standard for senior engineering positions. The probationary period was reasonable. The performance metrics were objective rather than subjective. It was real. This was actually happening. Cameron signed the document electronically, each stroke of his finger across the phone screen, feeling like commitment, like burning bridges, like stepping off a cliff and hoping the landing wouldn't destroy him. Then he typed a response to Vivian, "Contract signed. Thank you for this opportunity. I won't let you down." Her reply came within minutes. "You won't let yourself down. That's what matters. See you in 2 weeks." 2 weeks until his life transformed, until Cameron Wells, the security guard, became Cameron Wells, the engineer again, until possibility replaced survival as the defining characteristic of his existence. 2 weeks to explain this change to Lucas, to prepare for challenges he couldn't fully anticipate, to steel himself against the fear that whispered, this was too good to be true, that disaster waited just beyond his current vision. But tonight, in the quiet of his apartment with his son sleeping peacefully and a signed contract on his phone, Cameron allowed himself to believe, to hope, to imagine a future where extraordinary things were possible, where second chances existed, where one act of decency toward a stranger had somehow rewritten everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The next 2 weeks would test his resolve. The 6-month probationary period would determine whether this opportunity was genuine or cruel false start. But tonight, Cameron Wells was an engineer again, and that truth felt like coming home after years lost in the wilderness, like resurrection after death, like proof that invisible people could become visible if just one person bothered to look. He closed his notebook, turned off the kitchen light, and lay down on the pull-out couch that would be his bed for only 2 more weeks if everything went according to plan. Sleep came easier than it had in months, untroubled by the usual anxiety about bills and schedules and the relentless grind of survival. His last conscious thought was of Lucas's smile when hearing the news of Rebecca's imagined approval of Vivian's words that he was extraordinary and deserved the chance to prove it. The extraordinary part remained to be seen. But the chance was real, and for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough. The problem started on Cameron's 3rd day as a senior mechanical engineer at Stellar Dynamics. He'd spent the first 48 hours in a blur of onboarding procedures that felt surreal after 3 years of invisibility. HR processed paperwork with efficient indifference, explaining health insurance options and retirement contribution matches with the assumption he understood financial planning beyond choosing which bill to pay late. The engineering department occupied the entire 17th floor, an open workspace designed to foster collaboration, filled with standing desks and whiteboard walls and prototype equipment that made Cameron's hands itch to start building. His supervisor, Marcus Chen, was a decade younger but genuinely welcoming, walking Cameron through active projects without condescension. The automated inventory system had been assigned to Cameron immediately his designs from the notebooks already uploaded into the company's project management system. Seeing his private sketches transformed into official work orders created vertigo, the collision of fantasy and reality leaving him unsteady. The other engineers were cordial, if reserved, introducing themselves with varying degrees of curiosity. A woman named Jennifer Park, specializing in hydraulics, asked intelligent questions about his servo motor calculations. A guy called David Something, who handled software integration, offered help with the programming interfaces. Nobody mentioned the security desk or questioned how a guard had suddenly materialized as their colleague. The transition felt almost normal, almost sustainable, almost too smooth to be real. Then Jerome called during lunch break on day 3. Cameron stepped into the stairwell for privacy, recognizing the security desk number on his phone screen. His old colleague's voice came through, tense, uncomfortable with whatever message he'd been tasked to deliver. "Hey man, I probably shouldn't be calling, but I thought you should know. There's an article, some business blog, about you and Miss Harper. Cameron's stomach dropped. What kind of article? The kind that asks questions. About how you got promoted. About you being at her place. People are talking. He ended the call and pulled up his phone's browser, searching for his own name combined with Stellar Dynamics. The results appeared instantly, a blog post from a site called Chicago Business Insider that specialized in corporate gossip disguised as investigative journalism. The headline made his vision tunnel: Stellar Dynamics CEO grants mysterious promotion after private encounter. The article was 300 words of innuendo and speculation, quoting anonymous sources who claimed Cameron had been seen leaving a building with Vivian, who suggested there was a special relationship between the CEO and a former security guard, who questioned whether the promotion was based on merit or other factors. The writer stopped just short of explicit accusations, using phrases like raises concerns about and creates the appearance of impropriety to imply everything without committing to anything actionable. They'd gotten details wrong. The building mentioned wasn't Cameron's apartment complex. The timeline was off by several hours. But accuracy didn't matter because the narrative was too compelling to resist powerful woman struggling, man's sudden promotion after private meeting. The truth was irrelevant compared to the story people wanted to believe. Cameron read the article 3 times each pass, revealing new horrors. A quote from a department insider suggesting other engineers felt the promotion was unearned. Mention of Cameron's employment history, the 3-year gap framed as suspicious rather than tragic. A final paragraph noting that Stellar Dynamics board would likely scrutinize the situation given potential PR ramifications. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Saw the article, don't let it get to you, your work speaks for itself. Another text, this one from a number he didn't recognize. Is it true you're sleeping with the CEO? How much does that pay? He blocked the number, but more messages arrived within minutes. Some supportive, most hostile, a few explicit enough to make his hands shake. Someone had leaked his personal phone number, probably pulled from the company directory he'd just been added to. The invasion felt violating intimate details of his life, becoming public entertainment. Cameron forced himself to return to his desk, to act as though nothing had changed, to pretend the stares from colleagues across the floor weren't loaded with new meaning. Jennifer avoided eye contact when he passed her workstation. David was suddenly too busy to continue their conversation about programming interfaces. The comfortable anonymity of his first 2 days evaporated, replaced by hypervisibility that felt like standing naked under surgical lights. By 4 o'clock, the article had spread throughout the building. Cameron overheard conversations in the break room, voices dropping when he entered, whispers that weren't quite quiet enough to miss completely. A woman from accounting made a joke about sleeping your way to the top, not realizing he could hear from the next aisle. Laughter followed, complicit and cruel. He left at 5, exactly, abandoning work that suddenly felt impossible to concentrate on taking the elevator to the lobby where Jerome sat at the security desk, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Their eyes met briefly before Cameron pushed through the doors into evening air that felt too thin to properly fill his lungs. The bus ride home passed in numb silence. He'd known this was possible, had anticipated that people would question his promotion, had tried to prepare for skepticism. But preparation was useless against the actual experience of being reduced to gossip, of having 3 years of survival and struggle, dismissed as scheme, of watching the opportunity he'd barely allowed himself to hope for become poisoned before it could fully materialize. Lucas was waiting when Cameron unlocked the apartment door, homework abandoned on his desk, face streaked with tears he tried to hide. The boy launched himself at his father with desperate urgency, small body shaking with sobs he'd been holding back. The story emerged in fragments between gasps. Kids at school had seen the article, or their parents had, and children possessed neither subtlety nor mercy when cruelty presented itself. They'd asked Lucas if his dad was the CEO's boyfriend. They'd made jokes about dads who couldn't get jobs without help. One kid, the worst kind of bully, had suggested maybe Cameron was only good at one thing, and it wasn't engineering. Lucas hadn't understood all the implications, but he'd understood enough to know his father was being attacked, that the happiness of 3 days ago had transformed into something ugly. He tried to defend Cameron, explaining about the notebooks and the designs, but explanations couldn't compete with scandal, and 8-year-olds weren't equipped to handle adult cynicism filtered through childhood cruelty. Cameron held his son while rage and helplessness warred in his chest. This was what he'd feared, the collateral damage of hope, the price extracted when people like him tried to rise above their assigned station. Lucas was paying for his father's audacity suffering because Cameron had dared to believe that extraordinary people could come from ordinary places. It's not true, buddy. None of what they're saying is true. Miss Harper saw my work and recognized I was qualified. That's all. The words felt hollow, even as he spoke them, insufficient protection against a world that preferred sensational lies to boring truth. Lucas pulled back, eyes red and swollen face, reflecting pain that shouldn't belong to children. Why are people being so mean? Because some people don't like it when things change. Because they'd rather believe the worst than give anyone the benefit of doubt. Because the world isn't always fair. Are you going to lose your job? The question pierced him. I don't know. Maybe, but whatever happens, we're going to be okay. He didn't believe it, couldn't make the reassurance sound genuine, but Lucas needed something to hold on to, some foundation when everything else was shifting. They ordered pizza because cooking required energy. Cameron didn't possess eating in silence that felt heavy with unspoken fears. Vivian called at 8:30, her voice tight with controlled fury. Have you seen it? Yeah, I'm calling an emergency board meeting. This is defamation. This is unacceptable. I'm going to make them print a retraction. That won't help. The story is out. Retractions don't undo damage. A pause, then her voice softened. Are you okay? Is Lucas okay? Cameron looked at his son, already in pajamas, curled on the couch with exhaustion and misery evident in every line of his small body. We're managing. This is what I was afraid of. I know. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this. Should have controlled the narrative better. The board is meeting tomorrow at 10. They want both of us there. They're concerned about optics, about potential scandal affecting the company's reputation. You mean they want me to audition for a job you already offered? They want to make sure this doesn't become a PR nightmare. Vivian's frustration bled through despite obvious attempts at control. I believe in you, but the board has final say on senior hires. We need to show them this was legitimate, that your qualifications are genuine. What time tomorrow at 10? Conference room, a 20th floor. Bring your notebooks. Bring documentation of your previous engineering work from Baxter, if you still have it. Bring anything that proves you earned this position. The weight of it settled like stones in his stomach. He'd have to perform, justify his existence, prove his worth to people who'd already decided he was guilty. The presumption of innocence didn't apply when the accused was poor and the accuser was powerful consensus. And Vivian added, voice dropping to something almost pleading, bring your dignity. Don't let them make you feel small. You deserve to be there. The call ended, leaving Cameron alone with his sleeping son and the knowledge that tomorrow would either validate everything or confirm his worst fears. He checked his phone one final time before bed, finding 17 new messages, most hostile, several threatening. The anonymity of the internet had unleashed something vicious. People who'd never met him passing judgment based on headlines and assumptions. He blocked numbers until his fingers cramped, then set the phone face down on the kitchen table and tried to sleep. Rest came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of boardrooms and pointing fingers of Rebecca asking why he'd risked their son's well-being for pride of Vivian's face, transforming from supportive to disgusted when she realized what she'd actually hired. Morning arrived with gray sky and November cold that had deepened overnight. Cameron dressed in the suit he'd bought on clearance after signing the contract, cheap fabric that pulled awkwardly across his shoulders, but still better than anything else he owned. He checked his reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw someone pretending to be professional, costume poorly fitted to actor miscast in the role. Lucas woke anxious, asking if today was when Dad had to prove he wasn't lying. The phrasing cut deep because that's exactly what this was, an accusation of dishonesty that required defense rather than presumption of truth. Cameron made breakfast with hands that wanted to shake, got Lucas ready for school with cheerfulness he manufactured from nothing, walked his son to the bus stop with dread coiling in his chest. The bus that carried Cameron downtown felt like transport to execution. He arrived at Stellar Dynamics at 9:45, giving himself 15 minutes to mentally prepare for whatever awaited. The lobby was busy with morning arrivals, engineers and administrators flowing toward elevators with coffee cups and purposeful strides. Several people noticed him conversations pausing mid-sentence, attention shifting to the man who'd become infamous overnight. Jerome wasn't at the security desk. Frank had taken the shift, an older guy who nodded at Cameron with expression carefully neutral. The elevator ride to 20 felt eternal, each floor marker illuminating with deliberate slowness, giving Cameron time to imagine disaster in escalating detail. Conference Room A occupied a corner of the 20th floor, glass walls offering views of Chicago, while ensuring everyone in the executive offices could watch whatever happened inside. Cameron entered at exactly 10, finding the room already packed with board members in expensive suits, their expressions ranging from skeptical to hostile to coldly analytical. Vivian sat at the head of the table, tension visible in her shoulders despite immaculate professional composure. She acknowledged Cameron with a nod that suggested solidarity while maintaining appropriate distance. Smart positioning, he realized. She couldn't appear too supportive without confirming suspicions about their relationship. Bradford Morrison occupied the seat to Vivian's right, silver-haired authority in his 60s, who carried himself like someone accustomed to obedience. He gestured to an empty chair across from him with the kind of casualness that conveyed superiority through seeming politeness. "Mr. Wells, thank you for joining us. Please sit." Cameron sat, setting his backpack on the floor beside the chair, hyper-aware of every eye tracking his movements. The room smelled of expensive cologne and fresh coffee, neither of which had been offered to him. Power dynamics established through small exclusions. Morrison opened a folder, reviewing documents with theatrical precision. "We've reviewed the blog post that's been circulating. We've also looked into your employment history more thoroughly. 3 years as a security guard in this building. Before that, a 2-year gap in formal employment. Can you explain why Miss Harper believes you're qualified for a senior engineering position?" The phrasing was designed to undermine, suggesting Vivian's belief rather than objective reality. Cameron pulled his notebooks from the backpack, setting them on the conference table with deliberate care. Each one represented months of work, private proof that he'd never stopped being an engineer, regardless of what his job title suggested. "Because I was a senior mechanical engineer at Baxter Technologies for 6 years. Because I have these." He opened the notebook containing the inventory system pages, filling with calculations and schematics that couldn't be faked, that demonstrated understanding only genuine experience provided. "This solves a problem your team has worked on for 8 months. Miss Harper recognized that. That's why she offered me the position." Morrison leaned forward, eyes cold despite polite tone. "And how exactly did Miss Harper come to see your personal notebooks?" The question hung loaded with implication. Cameron felt heat rise in his face, understanding that answering honestly meant providing ammunition, but lying would be discovered and destroy whatever credibility he might still possess. "She was in my apartment." The murmur was immediate, board members exchanging glances that confirmed their worst suspicions. Morrison's expression shifted into something approaching satisfaction, the look of someone whose hypothesis had just been validated. "And why was our CEO in your apartment, Mr. Wells?" This was the moment, the choice between truth that sounded implausible and comfortable lie that would unravel eventually. Cameron chose truth because lies required better memory than he could maintain under this pressure. "Because I found her drunk in a bar, being harassed by 3 men. I intervened, got her to safety, and brought her to my apartment because she couldn't tell me where she lived. She slept on my couch. Nothing inappropriate happened. The next morning, she saw my work, recognized its value, and offered me a position." That's the entire story. The silence that followed felt absolute, every person in the room processing his words through filters of skepticism and preconception. Morrison's expression had hardened into something approaching contempt, the mask of politeness slipping to reveal judgment underneath. "So to summarize," he said slowly, as though explaining to a child, "you and Miss Harper had a personal encounter outside of work. She spent the night at your residence. The following day, she offered you a promotion worth over $100,000 in compensation. And you expect us to believe there's nothing inappropriate about this sequence of events. I expect you to look at my work and judge whether I'm qualified. Everything else is context. Context matters." "Mr. Wells," another board member spoke, a woman named Sheila Thornton, whose title Cameron remembered as CFO. "The optics are terrible. It looks like favoritism at best, something much worse at worst. How can we trust this was merit-based when the circumstances are so irregular?" Cameron pulled out another notebook, flipping to the waste heat recovery system, then the robotic assembly modifications. Then the supply chain optimization, because my work speaks for itself. This system could reduce your manufacturing energy costs by 30%. This modification increases precision while cutting production time in half. This optimization identifies inefficiencies in your current supply chain using publicly available data about your operations. He pushed notebooks toward them, watching expressions shift from dismissive to surprised to grudgingly impressed. I did this while working as a security guard while delivering food on a bicycle while cleaning offices at dawn. Imagine what I could do if engineering was my actual job instead of something I did at 3 in the morning, because I couldn't stop thinking like an engineer regardless of what my paycheck said. Morrison exchanged glances with other board members, silent communication Cameron couldn't decode. Finally, the chairman spoke with voice that suggested he'd made a decision before entering this room, and nothing presented would change it. Impressive doodles, Mr. Wells. But can you prove these designs are actually viable? Can you demonstrate they're not just theoretical exercises, but practical solutions? The challenge was clear. The gauntlet thrown deliberately. Cameron felt adrenaline spike, felt 3 years of accumulated frustration and anger, and desperate need to prove himself coalesce into cold determination. Give me access to your prototyping lab for 1 day. Give me tools and materials, and I'll build a working model of any design you choose. If it works, you approve my hiring, and this stops being a scandal. If it doesn't, I walk away. But you have to actually give me the chance, not just assume I'm unqualified because of how Miss Harper and I met. Morrison studied him with expression Cameron couldn't read, calculation happening behind eyes that had probably seen countless people make promises they couldn't keep. The chairman turned to Vivian, seeking confirmation she was willing to stake her judgment on this gamble. She nodded, once voice steady. I agree to these terms. Fine. Morrison returned attention to Cameron. You have 24 hours. Build us a working prototype of the automated inventory system. If it functions as you claim, we'll approve your hiring. If it doesn't, you withdraw your acceptance and resign quietly. We'll issue a statement that the position wasn't a good fit. No scandal, no further questions. Agreed. Cameron spoke before doubt could undermine certainty. 24 hours. Starting now. Starting at 8 tomorrow morning, Morrison corrected. We'll have the lab prepared. You'll have access to tools, materials, whatever you need within reason. But you work alone. No assistance from our engineering staff. This is your chance to prove yourself, Mr. Wells. I suggest you don't waste it. The board meeting dissolved, members filing out with expressions suggesting they expected failure, anticipated vindication of their skepticism within 24 hours. Cameron remained sighted while the room emptied, staring at his notebooks spread across the conference table. Physical evidence of 3 years that had led to this moment. Vivian approached after the last board member departed, sitting beside him in the now empty conference room. Her voice came quiet, almost vulnerable beneath the professional composure she maintained in public. I'm sorry, I should have handled this differently. Should have prepared for backlash, controlled the narrative, better protected you from this. It's not your fault. Cameron meant it, despite the situation. The world doesn't like it when people like me get opportunities. They need to believe we don't deserve them, that success comes only to those who fit predetermined categories. The world is about to learn something. Her voice gained steel conviction, replacing apology. You're going to build that prototype, and it's going to be brilliant, and they're all going to eat their words. What if I fail? You won't. But if I do, Lucas has already suffered for this. Kids at school are tormenting him. He came home yesterday in tears because of what they're saying about me, about us. If I fail tomorrow, it confirms everything they believe. It makes his pain meaningless. Vivian's hand moved as though to touch his shoulder, then stopped, remembering that physical comfort could be misinterpreted. Weaponized, use it as further evidence of inappropriate relationship. You're not going to fail, Cameron. I've seen your work. I know what you're capable of. Tomorrow you prove it to everyone else. She stood, smoothing her suit with practiced motion. I'll have the lab cleared for you. Whatever you need, just ask. Childcare can watch Lucas after school if you need to work late. We'll make sure he's safe and fed and comfortable while you focus. The practical arrangements mattered, logistics that would allow him to work without worrying about his son. Cameron nodded gratitude, then gathered his notebooks and left the conference room feeling like he'd just signed contract written in blood terms, non-negotiable, consequences, catastrophic. if he failed to deliver. The rest of the day passed in planning. He reviewed the inventory system design, identifying which components could be fabricated quickly, which would need to be ordered from suppliers, what modifications might be necessary to demonstrate core functionality without building complete system. The prototype needed to prove concepts showcase the distributed servo array responding to pressure-sensitive feedback, demonstrate load distribution without oscillation. Cameron left work at 3 to pick up Lucas from school, finding his son's subdued shoulders hunched with weight children shouldn't carry. They walked home in silence that felt heavy with shared understanding. Both of them were being tested, both facing judgment for circumstances beyond their control, both hoping tomorrow would provide vindication rather than confirmation of their worst fears. That evening, Cameron explained what would happen the next day. Lucas listened with seriousness that made him seem older than 8, nodding at appropriate moments, asking intelligent questions about what success looked like. "Your best is really good, Dad." Lucas spoke with certainty that made Cameron's throat tight. "You can fix anything, you always have. Tomorrow you'll show them what I already know, that you're the smartest person I've ever met, and they were wrong to doubt you." The words became armor protection against the anxiety threatening to paralyze him. Cameron tucked Lucas into bed early, needing his son rested even if Cameron himself wouldn't sleep. Then he sat at the kitchen table with fresh notebook paper, sketching the build, sequence, calculating material requirements, planning each step of the construction process with obsessive precision. He worked until midnight, then forced himself to bed despite knowing sleep wouldn't come easily. His mind spun through scenarios and contingencies, imagining each potential failure point, designing backup solutions for problems that hadn't occurred yet. The prototype needed to be perfect, needed to function flawlessly, needed to prove that 3 years of drawing in notebooks hadn't been delusional fantasy, but legitimate engineering preparation. Morning arrived too quickly. Cameron rose at 5, dressed in work clothes rather than the suit. Understanding that today required getting hands dirty, required physical labor rather than professional appearance. He made breakfast for Lucas, explained again where he'd be promised to text updates throughout the day. Vivian arranged for a car service to collect Lucas after school, ensuring the boy would be safely transported to Stellar Dynamics' childcare facility. Cameron hugged his son tightly before leaving, breathing in the scent of childhood innocence, drawing strength from the fact that Lucas believed in him even when Cameron struggled to believe in himself. The prototyping lab occupied half of the 16th floor, a space filled with equipment that made Cameron's hands itch with anticipation. CNC machines, 3D printers, welding stations, bins of electronic components organized by type and specification. Material stock ranging from aluminum extrusion to steel plate to various plastics. Computer workstations running CAD software and motion simulation programs. Everything an engineer could want, all of it accessible for the next 24 hours. Marcus Chen met him at 8, providing badge access and safety briefing with genuine encouragement that felt like lifeline in an ocean of skepticism. "You've got this, man. Show them what you can do." Cameron entered the lab alone, doors closing behind him with finality that suggested no escape until this was finished. He stood for moments, surveying the space, organizing mental workflow that would guide the next 24 hours. Then he rolled up his sleeves and began. The first 3 hours belonged to precision measurement and component selection. Cameron moved through the lab with systematic intensity, pulling servo motors from organized bins, testing each one for response time and torque consistency. The distributed array required 6 motors working in concert, their movements coordinated through central controller that would process pressure sensor data in real time. He'd designed the system on paper, refined it through hundreds of calculations, but theory and practice existed in different dimensions. Motors that looked identical on spec sheets behaved differently under load. Sensors that claimed millisecond response times showed variance when actually tested. Cameron's hands remembered this work muscle memory from 6 years at Baxter, guiding his movements, even as conscious mind wrestled with anxiety about whether 3 years away had eroded skills beyond recovery. The CNC machine hummed as it carved aluminum base plate, cutting precise mounting points for the servo array. Cameron programmed the tool paths from memory coordinates flowing from his fingers onto the computer interface without conscious thought. The machine's rhythmic cutting provided background music to his concentration, metal shavings accumulating in spiral patterns that suggested progress measurable in physical terms. By noon, he'd fabricated the structural components and begun assembly. The servo motors mounted to the base plate with specific spacing, each position calculated to distribute loads evenly while maintaining communication efficiency. Wiring harnesses connected motors to the controller board, color-coded pathways that would carry power and data signals. His soldering iron created joints that gleamed with professional quality connections that would hold under stress testing. Marcus appeared at 12:15 with sandwich and coffee, setting them on the workbench without interrupting Cameron's focus. The gesture felt kind, human connection, offered without expectation of reciprocation. Cameron ate mechanically fuel rather than enjoyment, tasting nothing, while his mind remained fixed on the feedback loop algorithm that needed programming before physical assembly could proceed further. The pressure sensors required calibration, each one adjusted to detect specific load ranges without triggering false positives from environmental vibration. Cameron worked with tweezers and multimeter setting threshold values that would allow the system to distinguish between actual weight and background noise. The precision demanded was exhausting, requiring concentration that left his eyes burning and neck muscles cramped from hunching over the workbench. Afternoon dissolved into technical problem-solving that consumed all awareness beyond immediate task. The controller board needed firmware that could process 6 servo inputs, simultaneously adjusting motor speeds individually based on pressure sensor feedback. Cameron wrote code in C++ language he hadn't used professionally in 3 years, but that remained embedded in his neural pathways like native tongue. The syntax flowed naturally despite the gap loops and conditionals arranging themselves into efficient structures. Testing revealed oscillation issues he'd anticipated in the design phase. When motors responded too aggressively to pressure changes, the system became unstable movements, amplifying rather than dampening. Cameron adjusted the PID controller parameters, tuning proportional, integral, derivative values until the servo array responded smoothly to load variations without overshooting or hunting. The work absorbed him completely, pulling him into mental state where time became meaningless and only the problem mattered. This was what he'd missed during 3 years of cleaning and delivery and security work. The engagement of his full intellect, the satisfaction of solving complex challenges, the creative flow that emerged when theory met practice and produced something functional. Lucas arrived at 6:30, escorted by the childcare coordinator, a kind woman named Patricia, who seemed genuinely invested in the boy's well-being. Cameron looked up from the workbench, registering his son's presence with surprise at how much time had passed. The prototype was taking shape but remained incomplete, half-finished sculpture of metal and electronics that suggested purpose without yet demonstrating it. His son approached cautiously, eyes wide at the equipment surrounding them, the organized chaos of engineering work in progress. Cameron wiped grease from his hands and knelt to Lucas's level, pulling the boy into brief embrace that communicated more than words could manage. "How's it going?" Lucas asked quietly, gaze moving across the prototype with 8-year-old's mixture of curiosity and incomprehension. "Slowly. Lots of small problems that need solving, but I'm making progress." "Are you going to finish in time?" The question carried weight that made Cameron's chest tighten. He wanted to promise success, to guarantee that tomorrow's demonstration would vindicate everything. But honesty mattered more than comfort, teaching Lucas that uncertainty was acceptable, that trying mattered regardless of outcome. "I don't know. I'm doing my best. That's all anyone can do." "Your best is really good, Dad." Lucas spoke with conviction that seemed unshakable despite evidence suggesting otherwise. "You can fix anything. You always have. Tomorrow you'll show them what I already know." The echo of last night's words hit harder now in this lab, surrounded by partially completed work, with deadline approaching and success uncertain. Cameron held his son's gaze, trying to absorb some of that faith to believe in himself with the same certainty Lucas maintained. "Thank you, buddy. That means everything. Now you should head back to childcare. I need to keep working, and you need dinner and homework." Patricia collected Lucas with gentle efficiency, the boy waving as he left, small gesture that felt like blessing. Cameron watched the door close, then returned to work with renewed determination. Lucas believed. Vivian believed. Whether Cameron believed in himself mattered less than refusing to disappoint people who'd invested faith in him. The evening hours brought new challenges. The mechanical assembly was complete, servo array mounted and wired pressure sensors calibrated and positioned. But the software integration revealed bugs that demanded systematic debugging. The controller would receive sensor data correctly, but calculate incorrect motor speeds, sending commands that cause jerky movements rather than smooth load distribution. Cameron traced the error through code line by line, finding the problem in a conversion function that translated pressure readings into torque requirements. The formula he'd derived on paper worked mathematically, but produced rounding errors when implemented in floating-point arithmetic. He rewrote the function using integer math, sacrificing minor precision for computational stability. Testing the revised code revealed improvement but not perfection. The system responded to loads but showed slight oscillation under dynamic conditions, movements that dampened over seconds rather than milliseconds. Cameron adjusted filter coefficients, adding smoothing algorithm that would average sensor readings over brief time, windows reducing noise without introducing unacceptable lag. The clock showed 9:40 when David Something appeared in the lab doorway, the software engineer who'd offered help during Cameron's first days. He entered with expression that suggested internal conflict, hands shoved in pockets with body language communicating discomfort. Heard you were building the prototype tonight. Thought you might want company. Maybe some help with the code. Cameron straightened from the workbench, surprised by the offer, uncertain whether to accept or maintain the isolation Morrison had mandated. Working alone was the agreement, but collaboration had always produced better results than solitary struggle. Yet accepting help meant owing debts, meant depending on others who might withdraw support when convenient. I appreciate it, but I'm supposed to do this alone. Board's orders. David shrugged, moving closer to examine the prototype. Yeah, well, the board can be idiots. This is good work. Really good. The servo array configuration is elegant. Mind if I look at your code? Cameron hesitated, then gestured to the computer workstation where the controller firmware displayed across the screen. David studied it with focus that suggested genuine interest rather than superficial curiosity, nodding at clever solutions, frowning at sections that could be optimized. You've got the core logic solid, but this sensor averaging could be more efficient. You're recalculating the full average every cycle. Use a rolling buffer instead, just subtract the oldest value and add the newest. The suggestion was correct optimization. Cameron should have implemented initially but had overlooked in his focus on functionality over efficiency. He made the modification watching the controller's response time improve measurably. The oscillation reduced further movements, becoming smoother. Thanks. That helps. David pulled up a chair, settling in as though planning to stay. I wanted to tell you something. That article, the gossip about how you got hired, it's garbage. I've been here 6 years. I've seen the inventory system project go through 4 different lead engineers. Everyone has failed to solve the load distribution problem. Your design, the distributed array with individual feedback, that's the solution we needed. Morrison might be skeptical, but the engineering team knows good work when we see it. The validation felt like oxygen after hours of holding breath. Cameron had spent 3 days surrounded by suspicion and judgment, questioning whether his skills were genuine or delusion maintained through notebooks nobody saw. Hearing another engineer confirm the work's quality created foundation beneath feet that had felt unsteady since the article published. I appreciate that, more than you probably realize. David stood heading toward the door, but pausing at the threshold. There's something else you should know. Jennifer Park, the hydraulics engineer, she's been telling people you don't deserve this position. She applied for senior engineer last year and got rejected. She's been spreading rumors that you got special treatment, that your work isn't actually yours. Cameron's stomach dropped. The sabotage he'd half expected, the betrayal that felt inevitable when threatened people faced competition. Why are you telling me this? Because she's wrong. And because I wanted you to watch your back. She's been asking questions about your prototype, trying to get details about what you're building. She might try something. The warning landed like prophecy, creating paranoia Cameron couldn't quite dismiss, despite wanting to believe professional colleagues wouldn't actively undermine each other. He thanked David, who left with encouraging nod, and returned to the prototype with new wariness. The lab had security cameras witnesses if anything happened, but Jennifer could be subtle, could introduce problems that seemed like Cameron's own errors, rather than deliberate sabotage. He worked through midnight fatigue, accumulating like physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders. The prototype was functional now, responding to test loads with smooth distributed motion pressure sensors, feeding data that adjusted individual motor speeds to prevent oscillation. But functional wasn't perfect, and perfection was what tomorrow's demonstration demanded. Cameron tested load distribution, by placing weights at various positions on the prototype's platform, watching servo motors adjust in real time to maintain level positioning. The system worked as designed, elegant solution to problem that had frustrated engineers for months. But he continued refining, tweaking parameters, seeking the marginal improvements that would transform good work into undeniable excellence. At 2 in the morning, exhaustion forced him to pause. He couldn't continue without rest, couldn't trust decisions made when his brain was operating on fumes. Cameron set an alarm for 5, giving himself 3 hours of sleep on the lab's break room couch, uncomfortable rest that would have to suffice. Dreams came fragmented and anxious. He saw the prototype failing during demonstration, Morrison's satisfied expression as suspicions were confirmed, Lucas's disappointed face when told they were returning to their previous life. He saw Jennifer sabotaging the servo array, David's warning materializing as reality, 3 years of work destroyed by someone who felt threatened by his existence. The alarm jerked him awake at 5 exactly. His body protested, movement muscles stiff from yesterday's labor in uncomfortable sleeping position. Cameron splashed cold water on his face in the lab bathroom, studying his reflection with detachment. Dark circles under eye stubble that had grown past 5 o'clock shadow into actual beard expression that suggested someone operating beyond reasonable limits. He returned to the prototype, checking connections that might have loosened overnight, verifying that nothing had been tampered with during the hours he'd slept. Everything appeared intact, but paranoia lingered, David's warning echoing in his mind. He ran diagnostic tests confirming all sensors reported correctly, all motors responded as programmed, all software functions executed without errors. The sun rose over Chicago, light streaming through lab windows, illuminating the prototype that represented Cameron's future. He'd built what he'd promised, transformed notebook sketches into functional reality, proved that 3 years of drawing in the dark hadn't been fantasy. The servo array gleamed with professional quality, wiring harnesses organized and labeled, controller board programmed with code that solved problems other engineers hadn't cracked. But doubt remained, insidious voice suggesting the prototype might fail under scrutiny, that demonstrations had ways of revealing flaws. Practice testing didn't expose that. Morrison and the board were waiting for any excuse to reject him. Cameron forced the doubt aside, focusing on final preparations, rehearsing the demonstration sequence, ensuring he could articulate both technical specifications and practical applications. Marcus arrived at 7 with coffee and encouragement, checking on Cameron with concern evident in his expression. "You look terrible, man. Did you sleep at all?" 3 hours? Cameron accepted the coffee gratefully, caffeine providing artificial alertness his body desperately needed. "It's done. The prototype works. Let me see." Cameron powered up the system, demonstrating the load distribution capability that made the design revolutionary. He placed weights at various positions, showing how servo motors adjusted individually to maintain platform stability. He explained the pressure sensor feedback loop, the algorithm that calculated optimal torque distribution, the PID controller that prevented oscillation while maintaining responsiveness. Marcus watched with expression that shifted from professional interest to genuine excitement. "Holy shit, this actually works, like really works, better than anything our team built. You think the board will see that? If they don't, they're blind. This is exactly what we needed for the warehouse automation project. This could save the company millions." The validation helped, but Cameron knew better than to trust that technical excellence would overcome political considerations. The board wasn't evaluating just the prototype. They were evaluating him, determining whether someone with his background belonged in their organization, whether the scandal could be contained or would metastasize into PR disaster. At 9:45, Vivian appeared in the lab doorway, dressed in power suit that suggested she'd prepared for battle. Her eyes moved immediately to the prototype assessment happening in seconds, expression shifting to something that might have been relief or vindication. "It's finished," Cameron gestured to the prototype. "See for yourself." She approached, studying the build quality, the organized wiring, the professional finish that suggested expertise rather than amateur effort. Cameron demonstrated the load distribution, showing smooth adjustment to changing weights, explaining technical details with confidence that came from knowing the work was solid. "This is incredible." Vivian's voice carried quiet intensity. "This is exactly what you promised and more. They're going to have to approve this, unless they don't want to, unless politics matters more than engineering. Then we make the engineering so undeniable that politics becomes irrelevant. The board meeting reconvened at 10 in conference room A. Same location as the previous interrogation, same faces arranged around the table with skepticism evident in their postures. Morrison sat at the head, Bradford Thornton beside him, other board members whose names Cameron hadn't fully registered, filling remaining seats. The room felt more crowded than before, additional observers invited to witness either triumph or humiliation. Cameron wheeled the prototype into the conference room on rolling cart, setting it on the table where everyone could see. The servo array gleamed under fluorescent lights, professional construction that spoke to skill and experience. He'd prepared brief presentation explaining core concepts, but the prototype itself would do most of the speaking. Morrison gestured for him to begin expression, suggesting he expected disappointment, anticipated confirming his pre-existing judgment. Cameron took breath, steadying himself against the weight of scrutiny, focusing on the work rather than the audience evaluating it. The automated inventory system you're looking at solves the load distribution problem that's prevented successful implementation of previous designs. The key innovation is distributed servo control with individual, pressure-sensitive feedback. Each motor operates independently, adjusting torque in real time based on load data, preventing oscillation while maintaining precision. He powered up the system, the quiet hum of servo motors filling the room. Cameron placed a weight on one corner of the platform, watching the motors adjust immediately to compensate, maintaining level positioning without overshoot. He added weights progressively, demonstrating the system's ability to handle asymmetric loads that would destabilize conventional designs. The pressure sensors provide millisecond-level feedback. The PID controller processes this data through algorithm that calculates optimal torque distribution across the servo array. The result is smooth, stable movement, regardless of load configuration. Morrison leaned forward, skepticism evident. What happens under dynamic loading? When items are moved during operation, Cameron had anticipated the question, had tested exactly this scenario. He placed a weight on the platform, allowed the system to stabilize, then rapidly moved the weight to opposite corner. The servo motors adjusted in real time, compensating for sudden load shift without visible oscillation. The system handles dynamic loads through predictive compensation. The algorithm tracks rate of pressure change, anticipating movements and adjusting motor speeds preemptively. Response time is under 50 milliseconds, faster than human perception. Sheila Thornton spoke from her position along the table. This is impressive demonstration. But can it scale? Our warehouses need to handle hundreds of items simultaneously. Can your design work at that magnitude? Cameron pulled out his notebook, opening to calculations he'd done months ago, projections for scaled implementations. Yes, the distributed architecture means adding capacity is modular. Each servo array operates semi-independently, coordinated through hierarchical controller structure. I've calculated specifications for systems handling up to 500 kilograms across 20 square meters. The cost analysis suggests ROI within 18 months based on your current operational expenses. He passed the notebook around, watching board members review calculations with expressions that shifted from dismissive to engaged. Jennifer Parks sat in the back corner, arms crossed, face frozen in expression Cameron couldn't quite interpret. Anger, perhaps, or fear that her campaign to undermine him was failing. Questions came rapid fire for the next 20 minutes. Technical specifications, cost projections, failure mode analysis, maintenance requirements. Cameron answered each one with confidence, born from months of design refinement, from understanding the system at fundamental level that allowed him to extrapolate beyond what he'd explicitly calculated. This was his work, his innovation, undeniable proof that capability existed regardless of job title or employment gap. Morrison exchanged glances with other board members, silent communication happening through subtle gestures. Finally, the chairman stood, approaching the prototype for closer examination. He studied the wiring, the servo mounts, the controller board, professional assessment that seemed genuinely curious rather than skeptical. The build quality is exceptional. Morrison's voice had lost its hostile edge, replaced by something approaching respect. This isn't amateur work. This demonstrates clear expertise and attention to detail. He turned to face Cameron directly, expression complex. Mr. Wells, I owe you an apology. I came into this meeting expecting to confirm my suspicions that Miss Harper had made an error in judgment. I was prepared to recommend your termination based on optics rather than merit. The admission hung in the air, vulnerable confession from man who rarely admitted error. Cameron remained silent, uncertain how to respond, waiting for whatever came next. I was wrong, Morrison continued, voice gaining strength. This prototype proves you have engineering skills at level we need. More importantly, it demonstrates work ethic and capability that exceed many of our current staff. The circumstances of your hiring were irregular, yes, but irregular doesn't mean inappropriate. I move that we approve Mr. Wells's permanent employment as senior mechanical engineer effective immediately. The words took seconds to process their meaning, filtering through Cameron's exhaustion-fogged brain with dreamlike unreality. Approval, vindication, recognition that he'd earned this position through merit rather than receiving it through charity or scandal. He'd proven himself to people determined to find him lacking, demonstrated that extraordinary people could indeed come from ordinary places. Sheila Thornton was second to respond, standing with an expression that suggested genuine pleasure. I second the motion. This is the kind of innovative thinking we need. Mr. Wells, welcome to Stellar Dynamics. Officially this time. Other board members voiced agreement, consensus forming rapidly once Morrison had shifted position. The chairman who'd been most hostile became strongest advocate, credibility lending weight that transformed skeptics into supporters. Cameron watched it happen with detachment, born from exhaustion and emotional overload, unable to fully process that the nightmare was ending, that he'd survived the trial and emerged validated. Jennifer Park left abruptly, door closing with force that suggested anger inadequately contained. David caught Cameron's eye from his position near the back, offering subtle thumbs up that communicated solidarity and congratulations. Marcus was grinning openly, professional restraint, abandoned in favor of genuine celebration. Vivian approached after the crowd had dispersed, most board members filing out to return to other responsibilities. Her expression held satisfaction and relief in equal measure, controlled emotion that suggested she'd been more worried than she'd admitted. I told you it would work out. You had more faith than I did. Cameron felt the exhaustion catch up now, that adrenaline was fading, his body demanding rest. It had been denied for 36 hours. I had faith in your work. That's different. Vivian glanced at the prototype at the notebook still spread across the conference table. This is extraordinary, Cameron. You've done something our engineering team couldn't accomplish. You've proven that taking a chance on you was one of the best decisions I've made as CEO. The validation felt surreal, impossible to fully accept after 3 years of being told he wasn't good enough, that gaps in circumstances disqualified him from meaningful work. But the evidence sat on the table, physical manifestation of capability that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. What happens now? Now you go home, get sleep, spend time with Lucas, come back Monday, ready to start the real work of implementing this system at scale. Her voice softened. You've earned this, Cameron. Every bit of it. Let yourself believe that. He gathered his notebooks, leaving the prototype for the engineering team to examine, and departed Stellar Dynamics with legs that barely supported his weight. The November afternoon felt bright, despite gray clouds, sounds sharper than usual, world more vivid in ways that suggested his perception had shifted fundamentally. The bus ride home passed in days. Cameron checked his phone, finding 17 messages, most congratulatory now rather than hostile. Word had spread, apparently David or Marcus sharing news that the security guard had built functioning prototype, that Morrison himself had apologized and approved the hiring. The narrative was shifting, scandal, transforming into success story gossip replaced by grudging respect. Lucas was waiting when Cameron unlocked the apartment door, having been brought home by Vivian's arranged car service. The boy launched himself at his father with desperate relief, small body shaking with emotion he'd been containing since yesterday. Did you win, Dad? Did you show them? Cameron knelt, pulling Lucas into an embrace that communicated everything words couldn't capture. Yeah, buddy, I showed them. I built a prototype and it worked perfectly. They approved my position. It's official now. I'm really an engineer again. Lucas pulled back, face streaked with tears that were joy rather than sadness this time. I knew you would. I told you your best is really good. The simple certainty in his son's voice broke something inside Cameron's chest, releasing emotion he had been suppressing for 36 hours of focused work. He cried, then pulling Lucas close, shoulders shaking with sobs that combined relief and exhaustion and gratitude and grief for 3 years lost to survival mode. They stayed like that for long minutes, father and son holding each other, while the magnitude of what had happened settled into reality. Cameron had done it. He'd proven himself to people who'd wanted him to fail. He'd earned his position through undeniable merit. He'd demonstrated that circumstances didn't define capability, that hope sometimes proved justified, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Eventually, they separated, Lucas wiping his eyes with typical 8-year-old self-consciousness about crying. Cameron made dinner simple pasta because cooking anything complex was beyond his remaining energy. They ate together, Lucas chattering about his day with renewed lightness, burden lifted now that his father's worth had been publicly validated. After Lucas was asleep, Cameron sat at the kitchen table with his newest notebook, not drawing but reflecting. The last 4 days had been brutal, testing him in ways that went beyond technical challenge. He'd faced public humiliation, watched his son suffer, questioned whether accepting Vivian's offer had been a catastrophic mistake. But he'd survived. More than survived, he'd triumphed against people determined to see him fail. His phone buzzed with text from Vivian. Morrison called me personally to say hiring you was best decision we've made this year. He wants you leading the warehouse automation project full-time. We'll discuss Monday. Rest this weekend. You've earned it. Cameron smiled, typing brief response, thanking her for the opportunity and support. Then he set the phone down and allowed himself to simply exist without planning, without worrying, without the constant mental calculation of whether next month's rent would be covered. For the first time in 3 years, the future looked different than survival. It looked like possibility. He thought about Rebecca, wishing she could see this moment, imagining her pride and relief. She'd always believed in him, even when he'd stopped believing in himself. She'd known that the engineer existed beneath the security guard uniform. That capability didn't evaporate just because circumstances forced different paths. Maybe she was watching, somehow seeing Lucas happy, and Cameron validated, and the life they'd built together, finally getting rebuilt into something stable. Before bed, Cameron wrote a note for Lucas to find in the morning. We did it, buddy. We proved that dreams belong in reality, not just notebooks. I love you more than anything. Let's go celebrate this weekend. Your choice what we do, Dad. He added a drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands, one tall and one small, both wearing capes. Heroes who'd survived the trial and emerged stronger. Then he slept, truly slept, for the first time since accepting Vivian's offer, resting without anxiety about tomorrow, because tomorrow had transformed from threat into promise.